I'm a hermit now, but it wasn't always this way. There was a time when I was the life of the party, the first person everyone called when they needed a laugh, an adventure, or just someone to fill a room with energy. I was the friend who was always invited to everything, the one who thrived in social chaos, who could turn any gathering into something unforgettable. But now I hide away in the dark corners of my house, the only company being the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It all changed after that night, that damned night. I was driving down a desolate highway, the headlights of my car cutting through the fog that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional rattle of my tires against the cracked road. I had received an invitation earlier that week, the kind that made your heart skip a beat. A glossy, red and black piece of paper that looked like it belonged to another world. The handwriting on it was elegant, perfect in a way that felt almost too precise, too deliberate. An exclusive masquerade ball, it read. Along with a location, an address I didn't recognize, nestled in the middle of nowhere. The invite itself seemed out of place, too elegant, too mysterious, but I couldn't resist. Something about it made me feel like I had to go, like it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up, no matter how odd it seemed. The night was supposed to be a celebration, an escape from my usual routine. I'd heard about the host before, whispers in the circles I once moved in. People spoke of them as if they were a legend. Some claimed to have been invited to their events, only to vanish without a trace afterward. But that was just gossip, right? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creeping doubt that was clawing at my mind. I had nothing to fear. I wasn't going to let myself get sucked into some paranoid fantasy. As the road stretched out before me, the trees seemed to grow taller, the darkness thicker. The sign for the venue appeared, its ornate letters barely visible in the distance, barely visible in the fog. It looked almost as though it had been there for centuries, forgotten by time. A large, twisted iron gate stood at the entrance, shrouded in mist. I slowed my car, my palms suddenly slick against the steering wheel. It felt wrong somehow, but I forced myself to park and step out. The moment my feet hit the gravel, I felt it. An eerie chill creeping up my spine. The house loomed ahead, an imposing manor that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Black vines curled around its stone walls, and the windows gleamed darkly, as if the house were watching me, waiting for me to enter. I almost turned around, convinced I had made a mistake, but then I remembered the invitation, the promise of something unforgettable. With a deep breath, I walked through the gate and up to the door, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the thick fog. The door creaked open as if someone had been expecting me. The air inside was musty, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. But there was something else, something more unsettling, lingering in the air, an almost imperceptible hum, like an electric charge waiting to snap. I stepped inside, and immediately the door slammed shut behind me, almost too loudly. A voice echoed from the shadows, deep and smooth, as if it were speaking directly into my ear. "Welcome," it said. I froze. The voice didn't belong to anyone in the room, but somehow I knew it was meant for me. And then I understood. This wasn't a ball. Not really. It was something else. Something I hadn't anticipated. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening finality. My pulse quickened as I stood in the dimly lit foyer, the voice still echoing in my mind. I turned, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty, just towering dark wood paneling, cobwebs that clung to the edges of the ceiling, and flickering candlelight that cast eerie shadows across the floor. "Welcome," the voice repeated, this time clearer, like it was right next to me, though I saw no one. It wasn't a person's voice. It was something else. A presence. It made my skin crawl, my stomach twist. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step forward, the heels of my shoes clicking on the cold marble floor. The air was thick, heavy, as if it had absorbed centuries of secrets. My breath came out in shallow bursts, but I couldn't move back. Something in the atmosphere was pulling me deeper into the house, urging me to proceed. From the darkness ahead, a figure emerged. The person was dressed in black, a perfectly tailored suit, their face obscured by an ornate mask, thin silver threads weaving intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. Their eyes, though, gleamed from behind the mask, cold and knowing. "Ah, the guest of honor," the figure said, their voice smooth like velvet. It felt wrong, though, like honey coated in poison. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what was going on, but no words came out. My throat tightened. "Don't speak," the figure instructed gently. "Just follow." I hesitated, but something deep inside me, some primal instinct, told me to obey. I followed them, my feet moving against my will, as if I were being drawn into the very bowels of this place. The hallway twisted and turned, like the house was alive, shifting around me. The deeper we went, the darker it became. The walls seemed to close in, pressing on my chest, and a low hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor. We arrived at a large door, its wood dark and weathered. The figure reached out and pushed it open without a word. Inside, the room was vast, a ballroom that seemed too large for the house. It was completely empty, save for rows upon rows of people. Each person was dressed in extravagant attire, like they had stepped out of a different era, their faces hidden behind masks identical to the one worn by my guide. A shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. "Dance," the voice from the shadows instructed, though it wasn't the figure in front of me speaking now. It was the same voice that had greeted me earlier, the one that sent cold shivers crawling up my arms. It was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. The masked people began to move. Their movements were stiff at first, like puppets, but then they seemed to come alive. They glided effortlessly across the floor, their bodies moving as if they were weightless, drawn to a music I couldn't hear, a rhythm I couldn't understand. It was a perfect, harmonious chaos. A dance I couldn't join, a song I couldn't hear. I felt a hand on my shoulder. The figure in front of me had moved, silently, and now stood next to me, watching. A deep breath filled my lungs, and I spun to face them. "What is this? What's going on?" I choked out. The figure's mask seemed to glint in the candlelight, the smile it bore now twisted, stretching unnaturally wide. "You're not just a guest here," they said softly. "You were invited, because you were always meant to be part of this dance. The invitation was not for your entertainment, it was for your participation." My blood ran cold. The floor beneath me seemed to rumble. The hum I had heard earlier grew louder until it was almost deafening. And then it hit me. A sickening realization, one that made my stomach lurch. The people dancing, their movements becoming more frantic, more erratic. They weren't human. Not anymore. They were trapped. cursed to perform this dance for eternity. Make your choice, the figure whispered, stepping aside, revealing a mirror on the far wall. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own. It was a shadowy version, its eyes black, its smile twisted. It was me, but it wasn't. I turned back to the figure, my voice trembling. What is this place? What am I supposed to do? The figure's smile widened, their voice a dark whisper now. You made the choice the moment you opened the invitation. You were never meant to leave. You're part of the dance now. Suddenly, the room went still. The music stopped. The dancers froze, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes begging for release. I didn't understand. How was this possible? I was just a guest. I never wanted this. But the door behind me had vanished. The house was alive with dark secrets that no one should ever uncover. And as I looked into the mirror again, I realized what I had done. I had taken the invitation. I had made the wish. And now there was no escaping the dance. The figure stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Welcome to the masquerade," they whispered, and the room seemed to close in on me. I never left. I never will. I first noticed the change one morning while brushing my teeth. It was a small thing at first, something I could easily dismiss. I glanced into the mirror, and the reflection staring back at me looked just like me. Yet something was off. My eyes were a shade darker, and my smile, though faint, was too sharp, too sinister. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just the early morning fog clouding my vision. But when I looked again, it was the same. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. After all, who would expect to see something so strange in their reflection? But over the next few weeks, I began to notice the same unsettling change more frequently. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection moving a second too late, or even smirking when I wasn't. It wasn't just in the bathroom mirror either. It followed me. Whenever I passed by a window or looked at the shiny surface of a polished countertop, there it was again, that strange, malevolent grin. The oddities grew. I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in store windows when I walked by, and it wasn't me anymore, it was something else, something darker. Sometimes it was mocking me. Other times it was just staring at me with eyes that weren't quite mine. I would look away, but when I glanced back, the reflection would be different, its movements too smooth, too deliberate. I couldn't tell anyone about it. I tried, of course, but all I got were laughs or worried glances. It's probably just stress, my best friend Tariq said one evening over drinks. You've been working too hard, man. You need to sleep more. At first I believed him. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just stress, maybe I was losing my mind. But the more I ignored it, the more frequent and intense the occurrences became. My reflection didn't just look off anymore, it began to react differently. One evening, after a long, grueling day, I stood in front of the mirror to wash my face. When I looked up, I froze. My reflection wasn't just smiling, it was smirking. A cruel, twisted smile that made my stomach turn. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't even moving. Yet there it was, grinning at me from the glass. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the mirror. The reflection mirrored me perfectly, until it didn't. It held its gaze with mine, the smirk remained, only now the reflection seemed to see me. Its eyes darkened, as if it were not just looking at me, but through me. Panic surged within me, and I jerked my hand away, stumbling backward. "This is not real. This is not real," I muttered under my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I began to question myself. Was I going mad? Was I hallucinating? But I had seen it, felt it. It was real. Whatever it was real. I decided to try to find an explanation, anything to convince myself it wasn't something supernatural. I researched, turning to books, the internet, even speaking to a couple of doctors. I couldn't find a clear answer, but I did find something that chilled me to the bone. There were old legends about demons that could possess mirrors, trapping their victims in the reflection, slowly driving them to madness. I laughed at myself for even considering such nonsense, but I couldn't deny it. I was scared. The reflection wasn't just a trick of light. It was alive somehow, and it was getting stronger. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it became. As the days passed, the reflections grew bolder. They weren't content with simply mocking me anymore. They began to interfere with my life. I'd wake up to find bruises on my body, deep purple-black splotches, like someone had gripped me too hard in their sleep. The scratches were worse. They looked almost self-inflicted, jagged lines like nails raking across my skin. Yet I knew I hadn't done it. At night, I could feel my skin burning, a deep, aching pain settling in my bones. No matter how much I tried to pray, it didn't help. If anything, the more I prayed, the worse it became. It was like my faith was feeding the thing in the mirror, making it stronger. Every prayer seemed to send a jolt through my body, every word like a spark that lit something inside me, a fire that I couldn't extinguish. My hands shook constantly, and sleep became a distant memory, interrupted only by feverish dreams where I saw my reflection, twisted and laughing, mocking me. The reflection's grin widened in my dreams, like it was preparing for something, preparing to take me. I started to lose control in small but terrifying ways. I'd snap at people I loved, my family, my friends, over the smallest things. There was a simmering anger inside me that I couldn't explain, a dark rage that just built up until I exploded. I tried to fight it, but it was like something was inside me, guiding my every move, pushing me toward the edge. It was on one of those sleepless nights when the weight of exhaustion and fear had worn me thin that I broke. I collapsed before the mirror, my knees hitting the floor with a thud. My hands were trembling as I reached out toward the glass. "Why, God?" I whispered, my voice hoarse from the days of unanswered prayer. "Why would you leave me like this? What have I done?" I stared at my reflection, begging for a sign, for something to show me that I wasn't entirely lost. And, for a moment, there was silence. The reflection was still, almost too still, as if it were holding its breath. I looked at it closely, hoping to find some trace of the me I used to know, some glimpse of the man I had been. But then something happened. The reflection changed. At first it was subtle. My reflection's eyes seemed to darken further, the pupils almost black now. But then it grinned, and it wasn't my grin. It was something else entirely. Something cruel, something malicious. I felt a cold dread wash over me as my reflection's lips stretched, impossibly wide. its teeth sharp and yellow. Then it spoke. "You are mine now." The words felt like a knife in my chest. My reflection reached out to me, its hand slamming against the glass with a force that rattled the whole frame. I screamed and stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to move, to flee, but the air around me seemed to thicken, like the house itself was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were pressing in, my vision blurred, and the world around me started to spin. I tried to shout, to beg for help, but my voice was swallowed up by the overwhelming darkness that seemed to have taken over the room. My reflection didn't stop staring at me. That twisted grin still stretched across its face. "This is who you are now?" And then I understood. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It had been inside me all along, feeding off my fear, my doubt. The reflection wasn't a separate thing. It was me. Twisted, corrupted. The more I tried to fight it, the stronger it became. In that moment, I realized that I had lost. I had lost my faith, my mind, and now I had lost myself. The mirror went black. The reflection was gone, but I knew it wasn't really gone. It had taken over. It had taken over. It was inside me, living in my very soul, and I could feel it grinning. I was no longer Elias. I was it. And I was never leaving. I wasn't looking for trouble when I bought it, just a little curiosity. I was at an old market, one of those places where time seems to slow down, filled with dusty trinkets and strange objects from every corner of the world. Among the antiques and oddities, something caught my eye. It was a small, ornate box, almost like a jewelry box, but with intricate carvings I couldn't quite decipher. The man who sold it to me, his face was a blur now, claimed it could grant me 3 wishes. At first I thought it was some sort of joke. I'd seen enough scams in my time to know better. But the box, there was something about it, something that made me believe, even if just for a moment, that maybe this was real. Maybe I was meant to have it. So I handed over the money, and the box was mine. That night, I sat in my dimly lit room, the box resting on my desk. It was strangely cold to the touch, as if it had been pulled from the depths of the earth itself. I hesitated for a long time before finally opening it. Inside was nothing but a piece of folded parchment. On it, in neat flowing script, was the message: 3 wishes you may have, but heed this warning. Each will cost you more than you know. I thought it was just some cryptic nonsense meant to add to the mystery, but my fingers trembled as I read it again. It felt too real, too tangible, as if the box itself was urging me to make a wish. So I did. The first one was simple. I wish for money, a lot of it. The box trembled in my hands, as if reacting to my words. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the next day, I woke up to find a check on my desk, an absurdly large amount of money, a number that I couldn't even fathom spending in a lifetime. At first I was overjoyed. I could buy anything I wanted, live a life of luxury, and never worry again. But soon, the consequences of my wish began to reveal themselves. People started acting strangely around me. Friends and family, co-workers, they all seemed to view me differently, as if they were afraid of me. Their faces changed when they saw the money, like they were seeing something dark and dangerous in me. No one would come near me. No one would talk to me. The wealth was isolating me, driving away everyone I loved. The more money I had, the more alone I felt. The loneliness crept in, gnawing at me. I was rich, but I was suffocating in my own wealth. So I made my second wish. I wish for love, for someone who will care for me, who won't run away. That's when things got worse. A woman appeared? Beautiful, kind, everything I thought I wanted. At first, it was perfect. She would smile at me with those loving eyes, and everything felt right. But over time, I began to notice odd things. She would speak in strange, cryptic ways, always repeating things I had never told her, knowing secrets about my past that I'd never shared with anyone. She started controlling every aspect of my life, from what I ate, to who I spoke to where I went. At first, I thought it was sweet, her wanting to be involved, to be close, but then it became suffocating. She wouldn't let me leave the house, wouldn't let me speak to anyone. She controlled everything. Every phone call I made, every step I took. Her love was a prison, and I was its prisoner. It was only when I tried to leave that she revealed her true nature. I got a glimpse of her reflection in a mirror. Her smile was gone. Her eyes, dark, hollow, stared back at me with a terrifying hunger. "You can never leave me," she whispered, her voice no longer sweet, but something cold, like the death of hope. "You wished for love, and now it's mine to take." That night I fled, I ran, but the memories of her eyes, her whispers, haunted me every waking moment. I couldn't shake it. Love wasn't supposed to feel like that. And so I had only one wish left. "I wish to undo it all," I whispered. Desperate, I wanted everything to go back to how it was, before the box, before the wishes. I wanted my life back. But the box, it didn't answer, not in the way I thought. The next day, I woke up to a world I didn't recognize. The people around me were gone, like they had never existed at all. I looked in the mirror and saw a face I didn't know. I wasn't me anymore. The world felt empty, hollow. My money was gone, my love was gone. Everything I had ever known was just a fading memory, replaced by a crushing, relentless silence. I realized too late. The box hadn't undone anything. It had erased everything. The world had forgotten me. I had wished away my entire life. I was nothing now, no one, not even a ghost. I went to the box, hoping for one more chance, hoping it could give me something, anything. But it was empty. The parchment was gone, the magic faded, and all I was left with was the void. The box had taken everything, and now it was waiting for its next victim. Here. The warning had been clear, and I had ignored it. No, each wish had taken something more from me, until there was nothing left. If you ever find a box like this, if you ever hear that whisper calling to you from the shadows, remember my story. You may think you can control your fate, but once you make a wish, it's no longer your own. I had to undo it. The money, the love, the torment. It was all too much. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. The wealth had turned me into a pariah, and the woman, I couldn't escape her either. Her voice echoed in my mind, her eyes burning into the back of my skull, reminding me that I had made a deal with something I didn't understand, something dangerous. Desperation clawed at me as I stared at the box. It had been sitting on my desk for days, mocking me with its silence, its promises of power, of desires fulfilled. but every wish I had made had brought me closer to a nightmare, to a dark reality I couldn't control. I took the box into my hands one last time, my fingers trembling. The parchment with the warning was still inside, but I no longer cared about its cryptic words. I was beyond caring. I just wanted it to end. I wished to undo it all, I whispered, barely able to speak through the panic that had lodged itself in my throat. I felt the box tremble in my hands, the air around me thickening, as if the very world was holding its breath. Nothing happened at first. I stared at the box, waiting for something, anything, and then the ground beneath me seemed to shift. A cold wind swirled around my feet, and the room darkened. The air grew heavy, as if something ancient was rising, something hungry. I should have known better. I should have known that asking for the impossible would have consequences. The money disappeared, but so did everything else. My family, my friends, even the woman who had consumed my life. Everything vanished as if they had never been. I was left alone in a world where I no longer existed. No one remembered me, no one spoke my name. My apartment was empty, my belongings were gone. It was like I had never been alive to begin with. I ran outside, hoping for some trace of normalcy, but the streets were empty. The sky above was a dull gray, and the world was silent, oppressively silent. There were no people, no cars, no sounds, just the void. It felt like the very fabric of reality had unraveled, leaving nothing but this emptiness, this desolate place where nothing mattered. The wind picked up, swirling around me in a chaotic frenzy, and in the distance, I thought I saw the figure of the woman. Her silhouette was faint, like a shadow stretching into nothingness. Her smile, no, that grin, was the last thing I saw before the world closed in around me. "You can never undo what's been done," her voice whispered, though her lips never moved. It was all around me, in the wind, in my mind. I fell to my knees, my hands clutching at my chest as if the weight of it all was too much to bear. I had tried to cheat fate, to take shortcuts, to bend reality to my will, and in the end, it was the wishes that had consumed me, not the other way around. Oh, the box was gone too. There was nothing left now, nothing but the echoes of my choices reverberating through the emptiness. The final consequence was this: I was trapped in a world that never knew me, never wanted me. My wishes had brought me nothing but the very thing I feared most: oblivion. And the worst part? I couldn't remember what it had been like before all of this. The memories of who I was, of who I had been, were fading, slipping through my fingers like sand. I had become just another ghost, another cautionary tale whispered in the wind. But no one would hear it. No one ever would. It started as a simple hiking trip, just me and Ben, a weekend escape to get away from the noise of the city and clear our minds. Ben was always up for a challenge, and I didn't mind the quiet. We chose a mountain that was known for its breathtaking views, but also had a reputation for being a little off. People talked about strange sounds at night, shadows moving when no one was around. But we weren't the superstitious type. We thought it was just local folklore. We set up camp just as the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long, twisting shadows on the forest floor. The air was crisp, and the mountain felt alive with the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. We unpacked our gear and started a fire, its warmth providing a comforting contrast to the chill of the evening. As the sky darkened, the wind picked up, and with it, an odd sense of unease. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the trees, a strange creaking sound from the rocks. Ben laughed it off, trying to lighten the mood with a few jokes. But something about the mountain didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was as though the land itself was watching us. We sat by the fire for a while, sharing stories, letting the night settle in around us. It wasn't until we began to hear the first chant that things began to take a turn. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint hum in the air. I assumed it was the faint hum in the air. I assumed it was the wind. But Ben's expression changed when he heard it too. He leaned in closer, furrowing his brow. I nodded, heart pounding. It wasn't just the wind. It was something rhythmic, deliberate. The sound of voices, distant, yet near enough to send a shiver down your spine. Ben stood up and looked around, squinting into the darkness. It's probably just some other hikers. Let's not get paranoid. But it didn't sound like any human voices I'd ever heard. There was something unnatural about it, something, ancient. It felt wrong. A chill ran through me as the chanting continued, growing slightly louder but still distant, as if it was coming from deep within the mountain itself. I glanced at Ben, who was still staring out into the blackness, his face pale. Maybe we should head back to town, I suggested, but Ben shook his head. We're fine. It's just wind playing tricks on us. Let's just stay put and see what happens. Reluctantly, I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We sat back down by the fire, but I kept my eyes fixed on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness. The night grew deeper, and the air colder. The chanting didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as though it was getting closer. I could swear I saw shadows flicker at the edge of the firelight, moving in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the forest itself was alive, its whispers and murmurs growing louder with each passing minute. Then Ben started to act strangely. He began to sway slightly, his eyes glazed over as if he were listening to something far away. I called his name, but he didn't respond, lost in whatever trance the voices had put him in. Panic surged through me as I reached out to shake him, but his body felt unnaturally stiff. He looked at me, his pupils dilated and unblinking. "What's wrong with you, Ben?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, his words barely audible. I leaned in closer. "Get out. They won't let you go," he whispered, his voice raspy and distant. "Ben, what are you talking about? Snap out of it." I shouted, but he just kept muttering, the chanting growing louder in the background, as if it were feeding off his words. I backed away from him slowly, my heart pounding. Was he sleepwalking, or was something else going on? The mountain had been quiet for so long, and now it felt like it was closing in on us, like the air itself was thick with some dark presence. I could feel it then, a presence in the air, something watching us, waiting. I tried to push the thought away, but the longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though the mountain was alive, and it didn't want us here. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The chanting wasn't just some random noise. It was a warning. "Ben, we need to leave, now." But Ben didn't move. He just stood there, eyes wide, staring into the dark, as though the mountain had taken hold of him. The fire crackled between us, but it felt too small, too fragile, against the growing weight of the night. I grabbed my pack and pulled him with me, desperate to get away from whatever was happening. But as we turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the trees, just beyond the firelight, there were figures, shapes that shouldn't have been there, standing perfectly still, watching us. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. And I realized with a sickening certainty that the mountain wasn't just alive. It was hungry, and it had already started with Ben. I didn't know what was happening to Ben, but I couldn't deny the terror rising in my chest. His eyes had gone completely black, no white showing, just endless dark pupils. His skin was cold to the touch, like a stone, and his voice had taken on an unnatural, hollow quality. The chants were louder now, surrounding us, coming from every direction. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The mountain felt empty and alive at the same time, and the fire flickered violently, casting eerie, distorted shadows across Ben's face. "Ben, snap out of it," I pleaded, shaking his shoulders harder. He didn't respond. The words coming from his mouth were no longer coherent, just an endless guttural string of sounds that didn't belong to him, or anyone for that matter. It was as if something had taken control of his very being. Suddenly, his head jerked to the side, and for a split second he smiled, a twisted, malicious grin that sent chills crawling down my spine. The air around us grew colder, a heavy pressure pressing down on my chest. The fire seemed to dim, the warmth slipping away, and the chants grew so loud it was as if they were inside my head. A voice, Ben's voice, spoke, but it wasn't him anymore. "You shouldn't have come here. You should have listened," it rasped, deep and distorted. I stumbled back, fear rooting me to the spot. The mountain had always been known for strange happenings, but this was something far worse. Something ancient and malevolent was using Ben's body to communicate, to torment me. "Ben, no, this isn't you. Please, fight it!" I cried, desperate, my mind racing for any rational explanation. But I knew in my gut this wasn't some trick of the mind. This wasn't just fear. Something darker had taken hold. Ben's body twitched unnaturally, his limbs contorting in ways that no human body should. He dropped to his knees, his hands gripping the ground like claws. His mouth opened wide, but it wasn't a human scream that escaped. It was a low, rumbling growl, like an animal in pain, but with an intelligence behind it, a mocking, dark intelligence that made my blood run cold. That's when I understood. This wasn't just a possession. It was something far older. A jinn. A spirit of the mountain, ancient and vengeful. I remembered the stories I had heard before the trip, the ones about the spirits that lurked on this mountain, the ones who took the souls of those who ventured too deep into its heart. The fire sputtered, flickering violently, and then went out with a sharp hiss, plunging us into darkness. I heard something heavy move in the shadows, something that wasn't Ben. A low, raspy voice echoed through the cold night, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. "You cannot escape," it whispered. Panic surged through me. I had to do something, anything. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. The ground felt uneven beneath my feet, as if the mountain itself was shifting, pulling me towards something terrible. I turned to run, but Ben... No! The thing that used to be Ben lunged at me. faster than any human should be able to move. I barely dodged, his hand brushing my arm with a coldness that sent an electric jolt of fear straight through me. I was caught between the mountain, the spirit, and the friend I thought I knew. "You can't leave," it hissed again, and this time it wasn't just Ben's voice. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping, ancient, and filled with malice. In a blur of panic and adrenaline, I ran, blindly, stumbling through the darkness, not daring to look back. The chants followed me, echoing through the trees, louder now, mocking my every step. My breath came in sharp gasps as I sprinted, the mountain seeming to close in on me with every passing second. The air felt thick with evil, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to twist and shift, as if the mountain itself was trying to drag me down. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and bend, each moment feeling like an eternity, but eventually, the sounds of the chanting began to fade, the pressure in the air lifted, and I could hear only the frantic pounding of my own heart in the silence. When I stopped, I found myself at the edge of the forest, just at the base of the mountain, where the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, trembling uncontrollably. I looked back up at the mountain. It stood silent and still, as though nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel it, in my bones, that something was watching me from the peak, something that hadn't let go of me. The mountain wasn't done with me, and neither was the djinn. I never found Ben, and I never went back. To this day, sometimes when the wind howls through the trees, I hear the chants, soft and distant, like they're calling me. I know the mountain hasn't forgotten me. And I'm not sure I'll ever be free from its grip. Halloween night in Los Angeles has its own vibe. The streets were alive with costumes, decorations, and the constant hum of traffic. But for me and my friends, the city felt too predictable. We wanted something more thrilling, something real. "Let's do something actually scary," my best friend Miguel suggested as we sat in his room, ignoring the sound of trick-or-treaters knocking on his front door. "What do you have in mind?" Tanya asked, twirling a strand of her black hair. Her eyes lit up in anticipation, a mix of curiosity and challenge. Miguel pulled a tattered wooden Ouija board from under his bed. It looked ancient, like something you'd find in a forgotten antique shop. The edges were frayed, and the letters on the board were faded, but still legible. "No way," I said, shaking my head. "That's a bad idea." "Come on, Leo," Miguel said, grinning. "It's just a game." "It's never just a game," I muttered. But the others, Tanya, Miguel, and his younger cousin Sophia, were already setting up candles around the board, dimming the lights to create a spooky atmosphere. The excitement in the room was infectious, even if my gut was screaming at me to leave. We all sat in a circle, the flickering candlelight casting strange shadows on the walls. The air felt heavier than usual, and even though I didn't believe in this stuff, I couldn't ignore the chill creeping up my spine. Miguel took the lead, placing his fingers on the planchette. "Okay, everyone, hands on," he instructed. Reluctantly, I joined in. The wood was cold under my fingertips. "Spirits of the other side," Miguel began in a mock-serious tone, "we invite you to speak to us. Is anyone here?" We waited in silence. Nothing happened. Tanya smirked, and Sophia giggled nervously. "This is dumb," I said, starting to pull my hands away. But then the planchette twitched. It froze. Looking at the others, who did that? Name me, Sophia whispered, her face pale. I swear. Stop messing around, Miguel, Tanya said, her voice shaking. I'm not, Miguel shot back, his eyes wide. The planchette began to move again, slowly at first, then with more purpose. It spelled out H-E-L-L-O. Sophia gasped, and Tanya's hand started trembling. This isn't funny anymore, she said, looking at Miguel, but he looked just as scared as the rest of us. Who are you? Miguel asked, his voice quieter now. The planchette moved faster, almost angrily. I-A-M-N-O-T-D-E-A-D. What does that mean? Sophia asked, her voice barely a whisper. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. If it's not a ghost, then what is it? The answer came quickly, as if the board had been waiting. I-A-M-A-J-I-N-N. Jinn? Tanya repeated, frowning. Like genies. Not the Disney kind, I muttered, my stomach sinking. I had heard stories from my grandmother about jinns, beings made from smokeless fire, capable of incredible things, but they weren't benevolent. They were dangerous. What do you want? Miguel asked, his voice trembling. The candles flickered violently, and a sudden gust of cold air swept through the room. The board responded, TOTAKEWHATWASSTOLEN. What was stolen? I asked, my voice shaking despite myself. REIGN? Suddenly, the candle closest to Miguel went out, plunging part of the room into darkness. Tanya screamed as the planchette began to move erratically, spelling out words too fast for us to keep up. Guys, stop! Let's end this! Sophia cried, tears streaming down her face. But it was too late. The room felt oppressive, the air thick and suffocating. A deep guttural voice echoed around us, though none of us were speaking. You were chosen to rule. We were cast aside. The voice was both inside my head and around us, shaking the very walls of the room. But your time is over. Miguel's eyes rolled back, and his body went rigid. He let out a low growl that didn't sound human. Tanya backed away, her hands over her mouth, as Miguel's body began to convulse. Miguel? I shouted, shaking his shoulder. But when his eyes opened, they weren't his anymore. They were pitch black, like two endless voids. You invited me, the voice said, coming from Miguel's mouth. But it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, more menacing. And now, I will not leave. The planchette flew off the board, hitting the wall with a loud crack. The candles all went out at once, plunging us into total darkness. Run, I shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand. But before we could move, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. You think you can escape me? The voice boomed, laughter following like a crashing wave. This is only the beginning. As Miguel, or whatever was controlling him, rose to his feet, his body twisted unnaturally, his limbs moving like a puppet on strings, the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on us. And that's when I realized we had opened a door we couldn't close. The voice reverberated through the room, shaking the walls and sending a cold, sharp pain down my spine. The candles sputtered, their flames growing unnaturally tall and blue. We all pulled our hands back from the planchette, but it continued to move on its own, jerking violently across the board. The deep, otherworldly voice boomed again, this time louder and angrier. You, weak creatures of clay, were chosen. We, beings of fire, were cast aside. But tonight, we take back what was stolen. What does that even mean? Tanya screamed, her voice breaking. Miguel stood up, knocking over one of the candles. We need to stop this. How do we end it? He grabbed the board, shaking it as if that would make it stop. Don't touch it! I yelled, lunging forward, but it was too late. The planchette flew off the board and hit the wall with a sickening crack. The room fell silent. For a moment, it felt like whatever had been here was gone. I exhaled shakily, glancing at the others. Sophia was curled up in the corner, her face buried in her knees. Tanya was frozen, her wide eyes dotting around the room. I think it's over, Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's when the lights went out. The darkness wasn't normal, it was suffocating, as if something alive was pressing against us. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from Sophia's corner. Sophia? I called, my voice trembling. Are you okay? She slowly lifted her head and my heart stopped. Her eyes weren't hers anymore. They were pitch black, glistening like polished obsidian. Her mouth twisted into a grin so wide it looked inhuman. You should not have called me here, she said. But it wasn't Sophia's voice. It was the same guttural, booming voice from before. Miguel stumbled back, knocking over another candle. What's happening to her? The possessed Sophia stood, her movements jerky and unnatural. She pointed at us with a trembling hand, her grin growing wider. One of you will stay. One of you will pay the price for summoning me. No! Leave her alone! Tanya screamed, tears streaming down her face. Sophia, or whatever was controlling her, laughed, a sound so distorted it made my skin crawl. Foolish girl, you think I care about her. I will take what I am owed. Without thinking, I grabbed the Ouija board and held it up. You want to take something? Fine, take this and leave us alone. The jinn-possessed Sophia tilted her head, the grin fading. You cannot bargain with me, human. You are beneath me. She stepped closer, the air around her rippling with heat. But perhaps I can show you mercy. What do you mean? Miguel asked, his voice shaking. The jinn's grin returned. Choose one. Only one of you needs to stay. No, I shouted. We're not leaving anyone behind. The entity laughed again, a sound that shook the walls. Then I will choose for you. Before I could react, the room erupted into chaos. The furniture flew across the room, the candles snuffed out completely, and an unbearable heat filled the air. I reached for Miguel and Tanya, trying to pull them toward the door, but it was like running through molasses. A blood-curdling scream tore through the darkness. I turned to see Miguel being dragged across the floor by an invisible force, his nails clawing at the wooden planks, his eyes locked on mine, wide with terror. "Help me!" he screamed. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm, but the heat was unbearable. My skin felt like it was burning just being near him. "Let him go!" I shouted into the void. The jinn's voice boomed, deafening and final. "You have made your choice." With a final piercing scream, Miguel was yanked into the darkness. The heat vanished and the room fell silent. The lights flickered back on, revealing the chaos left behind. Overturned furniture, melted candles, and the scorched outline of the Ouija board burned into the floor. Miguel was gone. Tanya collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Sophia lay unconscious, her face pale but her eyes back to normal. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The board lay in the center of the room, the planchette back in its place. Slowly, it began to move again, spelling out one final message. Next time, there won't be a choice. I grabbed a hammer and smashed the board into pieces, tears streaming down my face. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever we had unleashed wasn't gone. It was just waiting. With a final piercing scream, Miguel was yanked into the darkness. The heat vanished, and the room fell silent. The lights flickered back on, revealing the destruction around us. The walls were scorched, the furniture toppled, and the Ouija board lay in splinters on the floor. But Miguel was gone. "Miguel?" Tanya whispered, her voice breaking. She staggered toward where he had been, her legs wobbling like she might collapse. "He can't be gone. He can't." I didn't know what to say. My hands were trembling, my throat dry. All I could think about was the look in his eyes, his terror, his plea for help, and how I had failed to save him. Sophia groaned behind us. I spun around to see her crumpled on the floor, her eyes returning to their normal brown. She blinked a few times, her face pale and confused. "What happened?" she murmured. "You don't remember?" Tanya asked, kneeling beside her. Sophia shook her head. I felt something enter me, like fire in my veins. And then, nothing. I swallowed hard. "The jinn? It took Miguel?" Sophia's eyes widened. No, this is my fault. I didn't believe. I shouldn't have kissed Max. I'm too old." "It's not your fault," I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. "None of us believed." But the guilt was unbearable. Miguel was gone, and the jinn's words echoed in my mind. "You have made your choice." Tanya stood up suddenly, her fists clenched. "We have to get him back. There has to be a way. We can't just leave him." I hesitated. "We don't even know where he is or what the jinn will do to him." "Then we find out," she said, her voice steely. "We summoned this thing. We brought it here. We have to fix it." I nodded reluctantly, though fear churned in my gut. I had no idea how to confront a creature like that, let alone rescue Miguel from whatever hell it had dragged him into, but I couldn't just walk away. As we gathered what little courage we had left, the lights flickered again. A chilling wind swept through the room, carrying with it a voice, faint but unmistakable. "This is just the beginning." And in that moment, I knew the jinn wasn't done with us. Not yet. It was the middle of July, the kind of warm summer evening that promised lazy days ahead. Max and I had decided to spend the entire month at his family's remote cabin. We invited a handful of friends from work and school, hoping to escape the busy rush of city life and enjoy some quiet time in the woods. As everyone began to arrive, we fell into a comfortable rhythm. I was in charge of organizing the activities, setting up hikes, bonfires, and other fun stuff. Max handled the more technical side, making sure everything in the cabin was working, while the others pitched in with their own ideas. To start off, I suggested we gather for a campfire on the first night. I promised there'd be good food, drinks, and plenty of stories. Mac's cousin Claire was tasked with sending Tim and David to the store to grab the beers, while I asked Emily, the newest addition to the group, to join me in picking up the food. I figured it would give us some time to chat and get to know each other better. Meanwhile, Max, Claire, and Ben stayed behind to set up the fire and prepare the cabin. About an hour later, we all gathered around the fire with our supplies. The night was perfect, good company, warm drinks, and the crackling sound of the fire. But as we settled in, I noticed that Emily seemed a little on edge. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the tree line, as though something was lurking in the shadows. "Is everything okay?" I asked her, leaning in closer. "You seem a bit jumpy." She gave me a nervous smile. "I'm fine, just hearing things, I guess. The wind, maybe?" I tried to brush it off, but there was something unsettling about the way she kept glancing into the dark woods. She wasn't the only one, though. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the air. It felt too still, too quiet. Then, after a few hours, it started. At first, it was so faint that I thought I was imagining it. But then I heard it again. A whisper. My name. I froze. I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it, or if it was just the crackle of the fire playing tricks on me. But then Emily's voice shook me from my thoughts. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding. The others were laughing and talking around the fire, completely unaware, but something didn't feel right. It wasn't just my name that I heard. One by one, each of us seemed to hear our own name called from the darkness, but it wasn't like someone was standing nearby calling out to us. It was distant, as if the very forest itself was speaking to us. A faint whisper on the wind. And it wasn't just once, it was repetitive. Over and over, just loud enough for each of us to hear. The whispers grew louder until it felt as though the air itself was thick with them. My skin crawled. I looked around at the others, but no one seemed to notice how strange it was. Tim, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "Guys, it's probably just an animal or the wind messing with us," he said, though there was an unease in his voice that he couldn't hide. But it didn't feel like an animal. It didn't feel like the wind. It felt intentional, like something was watching us, waiting for us to acknowledge it. After what seemed like an eternity, we decided to call it a night and head inside to get some rest. The air was still heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I crawled into bed, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But just as I began to drift off to sleep, a loud bang shattered the silence. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The others must have heard it too, because within seconds we were all in the hallway, wide-eyed and confused. "What was that?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, my own voice barely audible. "Let's check it out." We cautiously made our way toward the living room, where the noise had come from. When we reached it, we were met with an unexpected sight. Mia, our friend, who had planned to arrive later, standing in the doorway as if she had just walked in. "Sorry I'm late," she said, glancing at each of us with a curious expression. "What's going on?" We all exchanged confused looks, unsure of how to process what had just happened. We had all distinctly heard that noise, yet none of us had seen Mia arrive. It was as though she had materialized out of nowhere. But none of us said anything. We just nodded and went back to our rooms, trying to shake off the weirdness of the night. As I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching us from the dark corners of the cabin. And despite my best efforts to ignore it, I knew something had changed that night. Something had been stirred in the woods, and we were far from alone. When we saw Mia, we all froze. She had arrived late, but none of us had expected her to show up now. She was standing in the doorway of the living room, staring blankly ahead. Her presence was strange, unsettling. She was supposed to be staying with her family in town, not here with us. I shook my head, trying to clear the confusion. "Mia," I called, my voice hesitant. "What are you doing here? You weren't supposed to arrive until later." Yeah, she blinked, as though just noticing us for the first time. "Oh, hey guys," she said, as though nothing was unusual. "I must have taken a wrong turn on the way here and ended up here sooner than expected." We all stared at her, trying to make sense of it, but there was something off about her smile, something that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her expression was almost too calm, as if she hadn't just walked in from the woods in the middle of the night. Okay, Tim said, his brow furrowing. "We heard a huge noise and you didn't respond, so we got worried." Mia shrugged casually, her smile widening just a bit too much. "I'm fine. Just a little tired from the drive, I guess." After a moment of awkward silence, we decided to move on, though none of us could shake the eerie feeling in the air. We all went back to our rooms, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of being watched lingered, and I kept hearing faint whispers outside my window. The next morning, things felt even stranger. As we were getting ready to go down to the lake, Mia found something pinned to the door. It was an envelope sealed with black wax. She opened it and pulled out a card with elegant swirling script that read, "You are cordially invited to a dinner party at the Riverwood Mansion tonight. Please come dressed for the occasion. A special surprise awaits." Mia held it up for the group to see, and we all exchanged curious glances. A dinner party? In the middle of nowhere? We had never heard of any mansion in this area. But despite the mystery, excitement bubbled in our group. None of us had ever received such a formal invitation, let alone been invited to a mansion. We immediately decided to go. We spent the day at the lake, laughing and splashing around, trying to forget the strange events from the previous night. But as we made our way back to the cabin, something was off. As we walked through the woods, the silence felt too heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When we arrived back at the cabin, though, something was different. Amber was missing. Amber was missing. The others and I started to search, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. We combed the cabin, the grounds, and the woods around us, but there was no trace. "We need to split up," Max suggested, his voice tense. "She's got to be around here somewhere." We decided to go back inside and start looking through the house. But just as we entered the cabin, we found her. She was standing still in the middle of the living room, her eyes unfocused. "Amber?" I called, rushing over to her. But she didn't respond. She was completely still, like she was in a trance. "Amber!" Claire shouted, shaking her. Amber finally blinked and looked around, as though coming out of a daze. "Oh, hey guys," she said, her voice flat. "What's going on? You all look so, worried." We all exchanged worried glances. "Amber, we've been looking for you. What happened? Where did you go?" She shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "I was just walking around, exploring. I found something interesting." Her voice trailed off as she pointed toward the dining room. We all followed her gaze, and that's when we saw it. The table was set, perfectly arranged, as though it had been waiting for us. Plates, silverware, and candles all glowed with a strange, eerie light. But what caught my attention wasn't the table. It was the strange mark etched into the floor next to it, a symbol I didn't recognize. "Amber, where did this come from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she said softly, her smile wide but distant. "But I think it's a sign for the dinner party." A chill ran down my spine. The invitation, the strange whispers, the missing time. It all felt connected. This wasn't just a normal weekend getaway. We were being lured into something darker. And as I looked back at the group, I knew they felt it too. Something was wrong, and we were about to find out exactly what that was. I remember the first time it happened like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. I was 9 years old, lying in bed, unable to sleep. The room was dark, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I hated those nights, when the silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing down on me. My thoughts swirled in the quiet, my mind racing with all kinds of thoughts. About school, my friends, the strange things I'd heard about in books, but none of it scared me. At least, that's what I thought until I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a noise, it wasn't a shadow, it wasn't anything you could point to or explain. It was just there. A strange, quiet sensation deep in my chest, something tugging at the edges of my awareness. It felt like a voice whispering to me, but not with words, more like a pull, as if my very soul was being beckoned. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe I was just overtired, but the sensation didn't fade. It grew stronger. "Come closer," it seemed to say. "Come see what lies beyond." It was too strange to ignore, but I wasn't scared. In fact, I felt curious, like this was something I was meant to experience, something I needed to understand. The pull was irresistible. So I let go. One moment I was lying in my bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, and the next, I was no longer there. I could still feel my body, still sense the weight of the blankets on top of me, but something else was happening. I felt light, almost weightless. I could see everything in the room around me, but it was as if I were hovering above it, detached, floating. The air seemed to shimmer, thick with energy, as though the very room itself had transformed into a living thing. I tried to move, and to my amazement I did. I was gliding effortlessly, as though I were flying. I floated above my bed, then drifted through the walls of my room. The house was quiet, but the world beyond felt alive, vibrant, like I could feel the heartbeat of everything around me. I passed through the ceiling and into the attic, then through the roof itself, rising higher into the night air. The streets below were distant, the houses scattered like toys in a vast dark landscape. I could see everything, feel everything. I was free. But then, a strange sensation washed over me, like a presence, an awareness that wasn't mine, a shadow in the corners of my mind. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just the dark sky stretching out above me. My heart began to race. I didn't know why, but something about being up here, in this new place, felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. I shouldn't have been here. There was something else out there, something waiting. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the city far below. The lights glimmered like stars in the night, and I wanted to explore more, but something tugged at me from the other direction. Something from deeper within the void. I felt like I was being pulled, not back to my body, but somewhere else entirely. The next few days were a blur. I kept experimenting with this strange new ability. At first, it was hard to control. There were moments when I would accidentally drift too far, and the weightlessness would turn into a disorienting freefall. My body would jerk awake in a panic, my heart pounding. But each time, I learned to go a little further, to hold on to the sensation longer. It became a game, a secret I kept from everyone. I learned that I could leave my body at will. Whenever I wanted, I could visit places I'd never been, see things I could never touch, and feel things that weren't there. The world was vast in a way that I never could have imagined before. The possibilities seemed endless. One night, I ventured further than I ever had before. I didn't mean to, but I was curious. I had been flying above the town, passing through houses and streets, when I saw something unusual. A building I didn't recognize. It was tall, old, and crumbling, standing on the edge of town like a forgotten monument. The windows were black, and there was something about the place that felt wrong. A presence lingered there, calling to me. Without thinking, I let the pull take me. I drifted toward it, passing through the walls like they weren't even there. Inside, the air was thick, colder than outside. The floors creaked beneath my feet, even though I was floating. Dust particles danced in the dim light, and I could feel the heaviness of time in the air. I stepped deeper into the house. Every room looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Furniture covered in thick sheets, cobwebs hanging from the corners of the walls. It was like a time capsule, a house frozen in memory. But it was more than that. It felt like a place that should not exist. It felt like it had been abandoned for a reason. As I explored further, I felt the oppressive weight of being watched again. It wasn't just the house that felt wrong, it was me. My body was miles away, but the sensation was real. Something was lurking in this space, something that had been here far longer than I had. In the dimness of the hallway, I saw a figure, just a shadow at first, moving slowly, as though it was waiting for me. My heart thudded in my chest. I tried to move toward it, but my feet felt glued to the ground. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding me in place. The shadow seemed to grow, and I realized I wasn't alone. Then it spoke. "Who are you?" a voice rasped, distant but unmistakable. I froze, and that's when I saw her. The building loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness, its silhouette jagged against the night sky. It didn't belong in the neighborhood. Nothing like it was supposed to exist there. The houses around it were neat and modern, but this place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. It was as if it didn't fit into the world at all, like it was part of some forgotten dimension that had bled through into this one. My curiosity pulled me closer despite a growing unease in my chest. The sensation, that strange whispering pull I'd felt before, was back again. Only this time, it wasn't the pull of curiosity. It was more like a warning. I hesitated for a moment. Should I turn back? Should I listen to the creeping sense of dread that gnawed at me? But before I could make a decision, something within me pushed forward. I wasn't just floating anymore. I was moving toward it, as if I didn't have a choice. I passed through the crumbling walls of the house, and the air inside felt thick, like the entire building had been holding its breath for years. Dust hung in the air like the remnants of forgotten memories. The silence was suffocating, but as I ventured deeper into the building, I noticed something odd. A faint light flickering in the farthest corner of the room. As I approached, I saw it, a figure sitting in a chair, bathed in soft, pale light, with their back to me. The figure didn't move, but something about it felt oddly familiar. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an overwhelming need to go closer. And then, as if sensing me, the figure slowly turned. I gasped, my heart stopping for a beat. It was my grandmother. But that couldn't be possible. She had passed away years ago. How could she be here? In this place, in this realm? Grandma? I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't understand. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. She didn't speak right away. She simply looked at me with a knowing smile, her eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of sadness and understanding. Her hair was streaked with silver, far grayer than I remembered. But her face? Her face was the same. "You've found me," she said softly, as if this was something inevitable. "I knew you would." I shook my head in confusion, stepping closer. How are you here? You're dead," she finished for me, her voice gentle. "Yes, I know, but death isn't the end. It never was for me, and it doesn't have to be for you either." I took a step back, unable to grasp what she was saying. "This doesn't make sense. You're supposed to be gone. I don't—" "Shh," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "Listen to me. I have something important to tell you, something you need to understand. What you've discovered, this power you have, it's not just a coincidence." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "What do you mean?" She looked around the room, her gaze distant for a moment, as though she were remembering something from long ago. "The power to leave your body, to travel through the realms, to be free of the physical world, that's not something you just get. It's a gift, one that runs through our family." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "Wait, are you saying you can do it too?" She smiled, but there was something haunted in her eyes. "Yes, I can, and so can you. It's why you're here now, why you found this place. The realms aren't just dreams or illusions. They are real, and they're all around us." I took a shaky breath. "But why? Why can we do this?" She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "This power is a part of us. It's passed down, generation to generation. I first discovered it when I was about your age. At first, I thought I was just dreaming, just like you. But there's a reason why not everyone has this ability. It's because the higher dimensions are dangerous, and the physical realm, the one you and I call home, it's the lowest of them all." I frowned, trying to make sense of it. "The lowest? What do you mean? Are you saying there are other dimensions?" "Yes," she said, nodding slowly. "There are many dimensions, each one more complex and powerful than the last. The physical world is where our bodies exist, where we're bound by time and space. But when you leave your body, you step into the astral plane, the bridge between worlds. And if you venture far enough, You can reach higher realms, places of pure thought, of energy, of chaos. Some of those realms are beautiful, but others are dangerous. I shivered, a wave of fear washing over me. What happens if you go too far? Her gaze darkened. That's the problem. You can lose yourself. Your soul can get stuck in a place that it can't return from. Or worse, something can attach to you, latch on to you, and follow you back. Some of the things in these higher dimensions are not alive, not in the way we understand. They're entities of pure darkness, of hunger, of desire, and once they sense you, they will come for you. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. The room around us seemed to close in tighter, and the flickering light grew dimmer, as if something was moving in the shadows. But, Grandma, I whispered, my voice faltering, How did you survive? How did you come back? She looked down, her expression shifting with a quiet sorrow. I was young, like you, and I was reckless. I ventured too far, to a place I shouldn't have. I lost something there, something important. But I was lucky. I came back. Not everyone does. I swallowed hard, trying to push the panic that was rising in my chest back down. And now I have this power. Am I going to make the same mistakes? She took a deep breath, looking into my eyes, her voice steady but filled with a hidden urgency. That's why I'm here. To warn you. You have a choice, my dear. You can explore, yes. You can venture into these other realms, but you must understand this. The further you go, the harder it is to return. And there are things in these realms that you cannot escape from. They are waiting. My mind was racing, but before I could ask anything else, the room around us began to tremble. A low, ominous hum filled the air, and the walls seemed to shift, like the very fabric of the place was unraveling. My grandmother's face turned pale. No, she whispered, it's happening, too soon. Suddenly, I felt a terrifying tug, deeper than anything I had experienced before. It wasn't just the pull of the astral realm, it was something else, something dark. And in that moment, I realized what she had meant. I wasn't the only one who had been watching. Grandmother's voice grew softer, more serious as she continued. The physical realm, the one we live in, it's the lowest dimension. It's where we're anchored, where things are stable, predictable. But beyond this, there are other realms, other dimensions that are far more powerful. Some of them are beautiful, places where the mind can stretch beyond anything we could ever imagine. But they are also dangerous. The higher you go, the more unpredictable the realms become. They're unstable, full of things that aren't bound by time or logic. The higher you go, the more you risk losing yourself. I stared at her, a wave of dread crashing over me. Losing myself? What do you mean? Her face grew solemn, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. Once you leave the physical realm, once you travel far enough, you lose your sense of who you are. The more you explore, the more you start to unravel. The higher dimensions don't play by our rules. They pull at your soul. Some people become lost forever. Others are never the same when they return. The price for exploring them can be steep. My mind reeled, my heart racing. But I've already been there. I've already traveled. I've seen things that didn't make sense, things that felt wrong. Is that what you mean? She nodded gravely. Exactly. You felt the pull, the darker parts of those realms. They whisper to you, lure you deeper. The longer you stay in these higher realms, the more they try to take from you. I know that feeling. It's how I lost something very important to me. I took a step back, my thoughts tumbling over each other. You lost something? I asked, barely able to get the words out. She didn't meet my gaze at first, instead looking out at the flickering light in the corner of the room, her eyes clouded with regret. Yes, she whispered. I lost my way. I ventured too far, and when I returned, I wasn't the same. My body was still here, but a piece of me, a part of my soul, was left behind. I could never get it back, and it wasn't just me. I lost something else. Someone... I didn't know what to say. My mind raced with questions. Was I destined to go through the same thing? Would I lose myself too if I kept going deeper? And what had happened to her? What had she lost? Then, out of nowhere, the room seemed to tremble. The walls began to warp, shifting like liquid, distorting the world around us. The flickering light in the corner grew brighter, then dimmer as if it were trying to escape. My heart pounded in my chest. Something wasn't right. Grandmother's face tightened. You've stayed too long, my boy. This is it. You've crossed the line. Something is already watching you. She reached out for me, her hands trembling. We need to leave. Now! But it was too late. The room around us began to dissolve, the edges of reality warping, as if we were losing touch with everything that was real. A horrible guttural sound filled the air, a low rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. From the shadows, something massive stirred, its presence suffocating the very air. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The creature was coming closer, its eyes glowing an unnatural red, its form massive and shifting, a nightmare made flesh. It wasn't even fully solid, just a terrifying silhouette of darkness that loomed closer and closer. Grandmother's grip tightened on my arm. Don't look at it, she warned, her voice shaking. If you see it, it will pull you in. You cannot look at it. But it was too late. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant, I felt something deep inside me crack. The darkness enveloped me, and the world I had known began to slip away, leaving nothing but the overwhelming feeling of being lost. Gone. Grandma! I cried out, reaching for her, but her figure was already fading, swallowed by the darkness. Help me! I don't want to... Her voice echoed in the void, a final warning. You cannot stay here. You must return before it's too late. But as the last of her words faded, I felt myself being pulled, dragged deeper, farther from her, farther from everything. The creature's presence loomed, pressing against my very soul, and I realized I was not alone. I was being taken, and no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't escape. The clock on the wall ticked in mockery of my restlessness. 2:47 a.m., and I was wide awake again. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the hollow space where Laura's pillow used to be. A year had passed, and the apartment still felt haunted by her absence. My therapist said the insomnia was a symptom of my grief, that my mind was a rat's nest of unresolved guilt and unanswered questions. I wanted to believe her, but tonight, the silence was suffocating, pressing on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment, desperate for motion, for air, for anything to distract me from the void. The streets were empty, bathed in the sickly orange glow of streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle pierced the quiet. It pulled at me, a sound so forlorn it felt like a voice calling my name. Without a clear reason, I found myself heading toward the station. The platform was deserted, shrouded in fog so thick it clung to my skin. The train was already there, idling like a predator waiting for its prey. I hesitated. I didn't know where it was going or if it even mattered. The doors hissed open and the warmth of the car spilled out, beckoning. My feet moved on their own and I stepped inside. The interior of the train was sterile and unnervingly quiet. Only a handful of passengers were scattered across the seats, each shrouded in their own bubble of silence. I took a seat near the middle of the car, trying to ignore the oppressive hum of the fluorescent lights. The train lurched forward and I stared out the window. The world outside was an endless expanse of gray, trees and buildings swallowed whole by the fog. My reflection in the glass looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, like a ghost. As the train picked up speed, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I glanced around at the other passengers. Something about them felt off. There was a man in a business suit clutching a briefcase as if it held his life savings. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Across from him, a young woman stared blankly at her hands, her fingers twitching as though she were counting something invisible. A child sat alone near the back, her wide eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. I was overtired, strung out from the sleepless nights. But then I heard it. A whisper. "Samuel." I whipped my head around. No one was looking at me. The whisper came again, soft and insidious, like breath against my ear. "Samuel, she's waiting for you." My heart thudded against my ribs. "Who said that?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The man in the suit turned his head toward me, slowly, unnaturally. His face was blank, eyes void of life. The young woman stopped twitching and looked up, her expression eerily identical to his. Even the child stared at me, her lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. Panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled to my feet, gripping the pole for balance as the train swayed. The passengers' gazes followed me, synchronized, unblinking. "Stop it!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure who I was yelling at. The train jolted and the lights flickered. When they steadied, a new figure was seated at the far end of the car. It was a woman, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Something about her was disturbingly familiar. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me toward her. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking. "Do I know you?" She looked up, and my breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes sunken but sharp. She smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "You don't remember me?" she asked. Her voice was a whisper, yet it filled the space around us. I faltered. "Should I?" Her smile widened, and she leaned closer. The air around her felt cold, like stepping into a shadow. "I knew Laura," she whispered. "She's waiting for you, Samuel." I froze. The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes reverberating in my chest. I turned to look out the window, but all I saw was fog and darkness. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Where is she?" The woman leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You'll see soon enough." The train came to a halt. The doors slid open with a hiss. revealing nothing but a black void beyond the threshold. The other passengers stood in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural like puppets on strings. One by one, they stepped off the train and disappeared into the darkness. I turned back to the woman, but her seat was empty. "Wait!" I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the void. And then the whisper returned. "Samuel, it's time." The last thing I saw before the lights went out was my reflection in the window. But it wasn't me staring back. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. They were piercing, filled with something I couldn't name. "You should," she said, her voice low and measured. "I knew Lara. She told me so much about you." My heart stopped. "Lara?" She nodded, her face unnervingly calm. "She's waiting for you, Samuel. Just a little longer now." The train jolted again, and I staggered, gripping the seat beside her for balance. "What do you mean? Where is she? Is she here?" Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of something darker. Pity, perhaps. "You'll see, when we reach the end of the line." Before I could press her further, the train plunged into darkness. The lights flickered violently, casting the passengers in strobe-like flashes. In those brief moments of illumination, I saw their faces twist and change. The man in the suit now had hollow sockets where his eyes should have been. The young woman's mouth stretched wide in a silent scream, her face frozen in a rictus of despair. The little girl at the back looked like a porcelain doll, her face cracked and fractured. And then the light steadied. The train car was empty, save for me and the woman. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice rising. She stood, smoothing her dress with mechanical precision. "You're almost there, but you have to face it, Samuel. The truth." The train screeched to a halt, the doors hissed open, revealing a platform bathed in dim, unnatural light. Beyond it, an endless expanse of shadow stretched out, broken only by faint, flickering shapes. The woman gestured toward the open door. "Go on. She's waiting." I hesitated, my legs rooted to the floor. "I don't understand. What truth? What is this place?" She sighed, tilting her head. "You know, you've always known." A lump formed in my throat, my body trembling as memories began to surface, memories I had buried deep. Lara's laughter, her touch, her voice on the last night I saw her, the argument, the slammed door. And then, silence. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "She's not. She can't be." "She's dead, Samuel," the woman said, her tone cold but final. "And so are they." She gestured toward the empty seats, all of them. "They're pieces of your past, fragments of the guilt you carry. This train isn't taking you anywhere. It's keeping you here, trapped in your grief." I staggered back, the weight of her words crushing me. "No, she just went missing. They never found her." "You never let them," the woman interrupted, "because you couldn't face what you did, couldn't admit that you let her leave, that you didn't stop her when she needed you most." Tears blurred my vision. "It was an accident," I choked out. "I didn't mean for it." The woman stepped closer, her face inches from mine. Her eyes burned with an intensity that made me feel naked, exposed. "The end of the line is here, Samuel. You can keep riding this train, reliving your guilt and regret forever. Or you can step off and let her go." I looked toward the open door, the platform beckoning like a void. My legs felt like lead, my body paralyzed by fear and shame. And then I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Samuel. It was Lara. Her voice cut through the fog, soft and familiar, filled with love and sorrow. My chest tightened, and my legs finally moved. I stumbled toward the door, stepping onto the platform. The train doors slammed shut behind me, and it began to pull away. I turned, watching as the passengers reappeared in the windows, their faces blank, their eyes staring straight ahead. The woman stood at the rear, her hat now gone, her face as hollow as the rest. As the train disappeared into the shadows, I felt the weight begin to lift. The platform dissolved around me, and for the first time in a year, I felt the cool night air on my skin. Lara's voice echoed once more, faint but clear. It's time to let go, Samuel. And then silence. The fog lifted, and I stood alone, bathed in the light of a rising sun. The void gave way to a soft, glowing light, revealing a serene field bathed in twilight. In the distance, I saw her. Lara. She stood under a lone tree, her figure radiant, yet achingly familiar. I approached slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. When I was close enough to see her face, the tears came freely. She looked just as I remembered, gentle, warm, and whole. Lara. I whispered. She smiled, though sadness lingered in her eyes. You've been lost for so long, Samuel. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice breaking. I should have stopped you. I should have been there. She reached out, her hand brushing against my cheek. Her touch was cool but comforting, like a breeze on a summer night. You couldn't have known, Samuel. You couldn't have saved me, but you can save yourself. I shook my head, tears falling. I don't know how. I don't know how to move on without you. You already have, she said softly. You stepped off the train. Her words hit me like a thunderclap, and I realized the truth. The train wasn't taking me to her. It was holding me back. It was my prison, built from my own guilt and refusal to let go. But what about you? I asked, my voice small. I'm at peace, she said, her form beginning to fade like mist in the morning sun. You need to be too. It's time to wake up, Samuel. Time to live. No, wait, I reached for her, but my hand passed through empty air. The field dissolved into light, and I awoke in my apartment, the first rays of dawn filtering through the blinds. For the first time in a year, I didn't feel the crushing weight of her absence. I felt her presence instead, subtle but real, like a whisper carried on the wind. I stood, staring at the empty pillow beside mine, and smiled through my tears. Lara was gone, but she hadn't abandoned me. I stepped to the window, watching the world come to life outside. Somewhere, deep within, I felt something I hadn't known in a long time. Hope. It was time to start over, time to let go. And this time, I was ready. I still don't know why I walked into that dusty secondhand bookshop. Maybe I was desperate for inspiration, hoping to find a spark among the forgotten titles and cracked spines. My debut novel's deadline loomed over me like a guillotine, and the blank pages on my laptop mocked me with their unyielding emptiness. The shop smelled of damp paper and ink, and a bell above the door jingled faintly as I stepped inside. Shelves leaned unevenly, sagging under the weight of countless stories. It felt as though I'd entered a place untouched by time. I wandered aimlessly until something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound journal wedged haphazardly between two volumes of poetry. Its cover was a deep, cracked brown, and the edges of its pages were stained a faint, rusty red. Something about it felt alive, like it was waiting for someone to pick it up. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open and was immediately struck by the elegant handwriting inside. Each entry was meticulously written, the ink still crisp and black despite the journal's obvious age. The words flowed like poetry, describing a woman's thoughts, fears, and strange encounters. The author's name was scrawled on the first page, Marissa Dale. I bought it without thinking twice, shoving it into my bag as though I were afraid someone might stop me. That night, back in my tiny apartment, I sat by the dim glow of my desk lamp and began reading. The journal entries were mesmerizing. Marissa's words painted vivid pictures of her life, her struggles as a writer, her isolation, and her relentless drive to create something extraordinary. But the further I read, the more unsettling the entries became. Marissa wrote about things she couldn't explain, whispers in the dark, shadowy figures at the edges of her vision, and symbols that appeared on her walls, drawn in what she described as inky black veins. She confessed to nights of feverish writing, her pen moving as if possessed, scrawling words she didn't remember thinking. At first, I told myself it was fiction. Perhaps Marissa had been trying to craft a story, much like I was. But something about her tone felt too real, too raw. As I read deeper into the night, the air around me grew heavy. The soft hum of my apartment seemed quieter than usual, the shadows in the corners darker. A faint, metallic smell wafted through the room, and I kept glancing at the corners of my vision, certain I'd seen movement. The next morning, I woke up with the journal still clutched in my hands, the faint outline of a sentence smeared on my palm. I didn't remember falling asleep, let alone writing anything, but there it was. She knows you're reading. My stomach churned. I laughed nervously, convincing myself I must have written it in a half-conscious state, mimicking Marissa's style. But then my laptop flickered to life on its own. I nearly dropped my coffee as the screen displayed a blank document, the cursor blinking. Slowly, words began to appear, letter by letter, as if an invisible hand was typing. "Did you dream of me, Evelyn?" I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse racing. This had to be a prank, some kind of virus. It had to be. That evening I tried to focus on my novel, but my thoughts kept circling back to the journal. Against my better judgment, I opened it again. The entries grew darker, describing Marissa's descent into madness. She wrote about how the journal itself seemed to demand her attention, how the words on the pages would shift and change when she wasn't looking. She spoke of vivid dreams where characters she'd created would whisper secrets to her, their faces impossibly close, their breath cold against her skin. Then she wrote something that froze me in place. "If you found this, then it's too late. The words have already taken root. You are not the first, and you won't be the last. Finish what I couldn't. Write the story. Set me free." The lamp above my desk flickered. I turned, heart hammering, and caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of my darkened window. A pale face, its hollow eyes staring at me from behind. I spun around, but no one was there. For the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. My computer screen would fill with those same eerie symbols Marissa had described. Twisted, looping shapes that made my head throb if I stared at them too long. Worse were the dreams. In them, Marissa appeared, her face gaunt and her eyes sunken. She stood at the foot of my bed, whispering in a language I didn't understand, her voice like nails scraping glass. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, my world became consumed by the journal. I couldn't put it down, even as it filled me with a bone-deep dread. Each word felt like a chain tightening around my chest. Then I reached the last page. It was blank, save for a single line scrawled in the center. "Finish the story, Evelyn." And that's when I realized Marissa hadn't been writing fiction. She had been trying to create something real, something alive, and now her story was bleeding into mine. I felt a presence behind me. Slowly I turned, my breath hitching as I saw her. Marissa. Pale, thin, and barely human, she stood in the shadows of my apartment, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "Write," she hissed, her voice echoing in my skull, "or let it consume you." The glimpse was fleeting, but enough to paralyze me. A shadow shifted by the doorway. Tall, unnaturally thin, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I froze, staring into the dim hallway beyond my desk. There was nothing there. I wanted to scream, to run, but instead, I did what I'd always done in moments of fear. I wrote. My fingers trembled as they hovered over the keyboard. I told myself it was a distraction, a way to push through the panic, but the words spilled out faster than I could think, like they weren't mine at all. Even Marissa felt alone in her apartment, trapped in a story not her own. The walls whispered her name, and the air grew thick with a scent of decay. The journal on her desk pulsed like a beating heart, waiting, watching, hungry for more. I stopped, gasping for breath. The air around me felt suffocating, thick with something unseen. My laptop screen flickered, and a single word appeared beneath my frantic typing. "Continue." I slammed the laptop shut again, but it didn't matter. The journal, Marissa's journal, had changed. The neat, flowing handwriting now bled into harsh scrawls, and the words rearranged themselves before my eyes. "Finish the story, Evelyn, or let it finish you." I tried to leave the apartment. I grabbed my coat, my keys, my phone, anything to escape. But the moment I opened the door, I was met with a wall of darkness. Not the kind you find outside at night, but something solid, impenetrable. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding. I was trapped. Over the next few days, or hours, or minutes, I couldn't tell anymore. My reality twisted. Characters from the journal appeared in my dreams, their faces obscured by shifting shadows. One of them, a woman with hollow eyes and ink-stained fingers, whispered to me. "She tried to create something real, Evelyn, but it wasn't hers to control." I woke to find the same symbols Marissa had described etched into the walls of my apartment, their jagged lines oozing a dark, sticky substance that smelled of iron. Objects moved on their own. My chair scraped across the floor. The journal slid closer to me, its pages fluttering as though caught in a breeze that didn't exist. I finally understood. Marissa's obsession wasn't just with writing, it was with creation itself. She'd tried to write a story so vivid, so alive that it could break free from the confines of fiction. And in doing so, she'd torn a hole in reality, letting something through Now that same obsession was consuming me. The only way out, I realized, was to finish what she had started. But the more I wrote, the more I felt the lines between fiction and reality blur. My words shaped the world around me. When I wrote about the walls cracking, they did. When I described the flickering lights, they sputtered and died. And then there was Marissa. She stood at the edge of my vision, always just out of focus. Her presence grew stronger with each word I typed. Her voice whispered in my ear, urging me on, promising freedom if I completed her story. But freedom for whom? The final entry of the journal appeared on my screen as I typed, the words forming without my input. To finish is to surrender. To stop is to be consumed. There is no escape, only the story. I realized then what Marissa had done. She hadn't failed to finish the story. She'd chosen not to, sacrificing herself to keep whatever she'd unleashed contained. The journal wasn't a relic of her failure. It was her prison. And now it was mine. I sit here typing these final words, knowing the choice I have to make. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I chose to finish the story, to set her free. But be warned, this journal, these pages, they will find you. They will whisper to you, tempt you with promises of creativity and greatness, and you, like me, will think you can control it. You can't. It's not just a story. It's alive. And now, it's yours. The journal sits on your desk now, doesn't it? You picked it up. You're holding it in your hands. It's waiting. I've always thought the house would be the perfect place to get away. After the divorce, the weight of my past felt too heavy to carry any longer, and there was no better escape than the place where it all started. The house I grew up in. Maybe if I could isolate myself for a while, away from the noise of everything that had fallen apart, I could finally heal. The old house, weathered but still standing, seemed like a refuge, a place where I could rebuild my life. It had been empty for years after my parents passed. The furniture had been left untouched, gathering dust like forgotten memories. I kept meaning to sell it, but I never could bring myself to. So, when the divorce hit, I made the decision to come back. I moved in with nothing but my suitcase and a few boxes, hoping that the solitude would be what I needed. At first, everything felt almost normal. The creaky wooden floors, the smell of old furniture, the way the light filtered through the dusty curtains. It was a familiar kind of quiet. But after the first few nights, I started to hear things. Little things, really. A soft scratching noise, like something small and sharp was dragging across the floor. I assumed it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? I tried to ignore it. It was nothing. Then came the footsteps. At first I thought it was my imagination, the kind of trick your mind plays when you're alone too long. But it was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The soft, measured footsteps echoed through the hall at night, slow, deliberate, like someone walking just out of sight. I got up a few times, checked the house, but no one was there. The doors were still locked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in the dark. Then, one night I heard crying. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable once I stopped to listen. A soft, muffled sobbing, like a child weeping in the next room. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the house shifting, but the sound persisted, a low, pitiful cry that made my stomach tighten with unease. I finally stood up, my legs stiff from fear, and walked to the door. The hallway was empty, but something was different. I could feel it. The air in the house had changed, thicker, heavier. The house felt less like a home and more like a cage. The sobbing stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on me. I closed the door behind me, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. But that night, the noises continued, louder and more frequent. Scratching, footsteps, soft whispers that seemed to come from all around me. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Stress, isolation, grief, they can do that to a person, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The house felt wrong. The next morning, I went into the living room to find the shelves had been disturbed. Books were out of place, some even knocked onto the floor. I hadn't touched them since I'd arrived. I checked the rest of the house. Things were moving. Doors that were once shut were now ajar. The kitchen light was on, though I was certain I'd turned it off the night before. It was subtle at first, just small changes, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I felt eyes on me, as though someone or something was watching me. I knew no one else had been here, but the presence in the house was undeniable. In an attempt to make sense of it all, I began searching through the old family photos. There were pictures of my parents, my grandparents, generations of my family. The house had a long history. But as I flipped through the albums, something stood out. Each generation, it seemed, had been marked by tragedy. The photos were filled with smiles, but there were gaps too. People who had mysteriously vanished. Deaths that weren't fully explained. A cousin who died under suspicious circumstances. An aunt whose disappearance was never solved. And then I found a picture of my ex-wife. Her face was smiling, but her eyes were hollow, empty, as though they had witnessed something terrible. I stared at the picture for a long time, my chest tightening. I realized that my family's history of loss wasn't just about the house. It was about something else, something I hadn't been willing to face. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by memories. My ex-wife's face was still staring at me from the photo, her expression beginning to change. It was as if she was pulling me into the past, into the wreckage of a marriage I'd never fully understood. The emotional abuse, the control, the things I'd buried deep inside. The house had a way of forcing you to confront your darkest regrets, and I had a lot of them. As I sat there, I realized the house wasn't just pushing me toward the past. It was demanding I face it. The more I tried to push away the memories, the stronger the presence in the house became. The footsteps grew louder, the whispers more urgent. The house was no longer just a building. It was a prison for my unresolved pain. And that's when I felt it. Someone was in the room with me. I turned, but the room was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I stepped back, my mind racing. The floorboards creaked. I wasn't alone. Before I could react, I heard a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but clear as day. "You'll never leave." I froze. The voice wasn't mine, wasn't anyone I knew. The house was alive with something else now, something that wouldn't let me go. I didn't know how much time passed. My vision blurred, my mind spinning. But when I looked back to the photo of my ex-wife, I saw something different. She was no longer smiling, and neither was I. As though something had taken a part of her, I felt a chill sweep through me as I stared at her photo. It had been years since I'd looked at any of these, but the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This house, my childhood home, wasn't just a place of family memories. It was a place of loss, a place of ghosts, real or not, that had haunted every generation. The house didn't just hold the echoes of the past, it forced its occupants to relive their deepest regrets. As I continued flipping through the pages, one photo stopped me cold. It was a family portrait from years before I was born. My grandparents, aunts, every face familiar yet distant. But standing at the back of the photo was a figure I had never seen before. A shadowy, indistinct person who seemed out of place, almost as if they didn't belong. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't look away. That night, the noises returned, louder this time, scratching, thumping, and the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. But this time, I knew it wasn't just the house settling. Something or someone was here, and it wanted me to know it. I opened the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The air was thick, heavier than it had ever been. The house felt alive, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me, suffocating me with its dark history. And then, as I reached the living room, I saw it. The shadow. It was standing in the corner, just beyond the light of the hallway. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, looming, and it didn't move. I couldn't tell if it was a person or some trick of the mind, but I felt its presence, sharp and cold. I took a step toward it, my mind racing with every possible explanation. But when I reached out a trembling hand to turn on the light, the figure disappeared. The room was empty, but the air still felt thick with something dark, something ancient. I tried to rationalize it, but that was impossible now. I knew this wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't a ghost or a spirit. It was the house itself. The house had been forcing me to confront something deeper, something buried beneath the surface of my life. The tragedy of my family's past, my own past, things I had tried to forget, had found their way back into my mind. The house had a way of making you face your regrets, whether you were ready or not. And I wasn't ready. The sobbing returned, softer this time, but unmistakable. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I reached the basement door, I hesitated. My hand rested on the knob, my mind racing. This was the last place I wanted to go, but the house was pulling me there. I had no choice. The door creaked open. Darkness stretched out before me, swallowing the light. I descended the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of every step pressing down on me. At the bottom I saw it, the small wooden box resting in the center of the room. The sobbing was louder now, but there was something else. A faint, some whisper, just barely audible, calling my name. I reached for the box, my fingers trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside was a photo. One I didn't recognize at first. It was a picture of my ex-wife. But there was something different about it. Her eyes were not the hollow ones from the family photo. These eyes were wide, terrified, as if she had seen something far worse than anything I could have imagined. And written on the back of the photo in fading ink was a single word: help. My heart stopped. And that's when I realized The house wasn't just haunting me, it had been haunting her too. I stumbled back, but before I could make it to the stairs, the door slammed shut behind me. The sobbing grew louder, the whispers more frantic, and then, as if from nowhere, a voice, clear and cold, whispered in my ear, "You can't leave, not now, not until you face it." I spun around, but no one was there. The house was waiting, and I wasn't sure I could survive it much longer. Repeat something in that photo that word help was a warning, but also a key. The door behind me slammed shut with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. But I forced myself to focus, to breathe. Something in that photo, that word, help, was a warning, also a key. The house wasn't just a place. It was a force, a malevolent presence, and I had unwittingly stepped right into its trap. The whispers continued to echo in the dark, and I couldn't tell if they were coming from the house itself or from somewhere deeper within me. "You can't leave." I backed up toward the stairs, clutching the photo tight against my chest. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The house was keeping me here. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder, heavier. There was a knot in my stomach that wasn't just fear. It was a sense of inevitability, as though I had always been meant to end up here, to face this moment. I remembered the stories now, those old family photos, the generations of loss, the people who had vanished or died under mysterious circumstances. But it wasn't just the house that had claimed them. It was their own unresolved darkness, their regrets, their unresolved grief. And now it was my turn. I felt it then, something shifting behind me in the dark corner of the basement. A shadow, long and stretching, growing larger, closer. I didn't need to look to know what it was. I could feel it, like a cold hand on my back. The presence of something that wasn't alive, but was very much aware of me. The house didn't just hold memories. It forced its occupants to relive their worst moments, their greatest regrets, until they couldn't escape anymore. I turned slowly, and there it was. The shadow, shaped like a person but distorted, jagged, as if the darkness itself had taken form. It stood there, motionless, its eyes two hollow pits that sucked in the light, and behind it, a mirror, a long, cracked mirror. I didn't remember being there before. It was reflecting something, but not me. It reflected her, my ex-wife. But she was different. Her eyes were wide, terror-stricken, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her face was pale, drained of life, and in the reflection, I saw something else. A figure standing behind her, something that wasn't quite human, something that twisted and writhed in the darkness. "She never left," the voice whispered, but it wasn't the house anymore. It was mine. My voice, deep and distorted. The figure in the mirror began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if it was coming for me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's you," I whispered, recognizing the voice. It was mine. The regrets, the guilt, the pain I had buried All of it was surfacing now. The house wasn't just showing me my past, it was showing me the truth I had never wanted to see, the truth I had buried in the deepest parts of my mind. I had never truly let go of her, of my marriage, of the emotional scars I carried, the manipulation, the abuse I had endured, and the ways I had in turn hurt her. We were both trapped in that cycle of pain, each of us too broken to escape. The house had forced me to confront it. The figure in the mirror reached out, its fingers long and twisted, and I felt something cold brush my skin. I looked down at my own hands and they were shaking, trembling, with a sudden realization. I wasn't going to survive this unless I faced everything I had tried to forget. I needed to let go, to forgive, not just her, but myself. I turned back to the shadow in the corner, the distorted figure now towering over me. It spoke again, its voice deep and guttural. You cannot escape what you refuse to face. The mirror shattered then, the sound like 1,000 broken pieces of glass, and in that instant I saw everything. The house, my ex-wife, myself, all of it unraveling in front of me. The shadow lunged at me, but as it did, something changed. The weight on my chest lightened. The oppressive air began to lift. I felt the house groan, the walls shudder, and then silence. I woke up on the floor of the basement, the photo of my ex-wife still clutched in my hand. The house was still there, old, creaking, but no longer suffocating. The oppressive weight had lifted. The air felt normal again. But I knew I couldn't stay. I stood up, my body weak, but my mind clearer than it had been in years. The house hadn't killed me. It hadn't claimed me as it had others, but it had shown me something I needed to understand. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the things we refuse to confront, the regrets we bury until they consume us. I walked up the stairs toward the light and didn't look back. The door opened easily now, the house finally releasing its hold on me. But as I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching me. It always would be, because the house never truly lets go. And neither do the memories we try to forget. I wasn't free of the house. But maybe, just maybe, I was free of myself. The rumble of my truck's engine echoed through the valley, the noise bouncing off the jagged cliffs that loomed over the mining town. I'd taken the job to escape, not just from the memory of Elaine, her laughter, her anger, the gaping void she left when she walked out the door, but from myself. The version of me I couldn't stand to face anymore. A geologist in a nowhere town, inspecting a mine nobody cared about, sounded perfect. I didn't expect anyone here to ask questions or want answers. When I rolled into Black Hollow, the first thing I noticed was the silence. A mining town without clamor was unnatural. No creaking machinery, no distant hollering, no kids chasing each other through the dirt streets, just stillness. A few faces peered from behind curtains as I parked outside the lone diner. It was late afternoon, but the sky had already started to gray, casting long shadows across the dilapidated buildings. Inside the diner, a single waitress leaned against the counter, absently wiping a glass with a dingy rag. Her name tag read Marla, and she looked at me with a mix of curiosity and dread. "You, Greg?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Yeah, here to check out the mine," I replied, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. Her brow furrowed. "You sure about that? Mine's been shut for years. Nothing to find down there but trouble." "That's what I'm here for," I joked weakly. trouble pays well." She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned in and whispered, "Listen, you don't need to go poking around down there. Folks say it's cursed. People who go in, they don't come back right. Or at all." "Whose folks?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Her eyes flicked to the empty booths around us, then back to me. "Just folks. Take my advice and head back the way you came. Whatever's in that mine, it don't like being disturbed." I left her with a half-hearted thanks and a bad feeling twisting in my gut, but the money from this job was too good to pass up, and besides, I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. The entrance to the mine was hidden beneath a veil of overgrown brush and rusting metal supports. The air changed the moment I stepped inside, cooler, heavier. My flashlight beam pierced the darkness, revealing walls streaked with iron and quartz. This was my domain. Rocks were predictable, reliable. If I could make sense of them, I could make sense of anything. But as I moved deeper, the weight of the place began to press on me. The tunnels seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, as though the mine had a life of its own. The silence wasn't total. It was layered with faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but too persistent to ignore. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. The echoes of my own footsteps didn't sound quite right either, like they were being followed. Hours passed as I mapped the tunnels, jotting notes on the strange formations and collapses that had rendered the mine unsafe. But my focus wavered. Something about the place felt wrong. Shadows danced at the edges of my light, and once or twice I thought I saw movement. When I turned, there was nothing but stone and darkness. Then came the voices. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs that I chalked up to exhaustion, but they grew louder, clearer. My name echoed through the tunnels, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. My chest tightened as I gripped my flashlight tighter, its beam trembling along with my hand. "Hello," I called out, hating how small my voice sounded. The mine swallowed the sound, throwing it back at me in disjointed fragments. "Hello, hello." My radio crackled to life, static screeching in my ears. "Who's there?" I demanded, but the device only hissed. Then faintly I heard it again. "Greg." I dropped the radio and bolted deeper into the mine, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care about the job anymore. I just needed to know what was down here. My flashlight flickered, casting sporadic bursts of light across the walls. I tripped over an uneven patch of ground and fell hard, my hands scraping against jagged rock. The flashlight spun out of reach, landing with a clatter. That's when I saw it. A faint, pulsing glow illuminated a passage I hadn't seen before. The walls were covered in carvings, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. Against my better judgment, I crawled toward the glow, my curiosity overpowering my fear. The tunnel opened into a massive chamber, the walls slick with some dark, viscous substance. In the center was an altar, and on it lay an orb-like structure that seemed to hum with energy. The glow emanated from within, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. My heart pounded as I approached, unable to tear my eyes away. The whispers crescendoed, filling my head with 1,000 voices all at once. They spoke of despair, of betrayal, of pain, my pain. Elaine's face flashed in my mind, her words cutting through me like a blade. "You'll never be enough, Greg." I fell to my knees, clutching my head. The pressure was unbearable, as though the mine itself was alive, feeding off my anguish, and then I felt it. A presence, vast and ancient, watching me from the shadows. I wasn't alone. The blast roared behind me, a deafening wave of heat and dust. I stumbled forward, throwing myself down as the ceiling caved in. Rocks and debris tumbled in every direction, and for a moment I thought I was going to be buried alongside the entity. But then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the cavern was no more. The tunnel ahead was blocked by rubble, sealing off the pit, and whatever horrors lay within, beneath tons of stone. My head throbbed, and my body screamed in protest as I pushed myself up, coughing through the thick haze of dust. My flashlight was shattered, but a faint glow filtered in from far ahead. The entrance! I forced myself to my feet and staggered toward it, every step a battle. My legs threatened to give out, but the faint taste of fresh air kept me moving. When I finally emerged from the mine, the cold evening air hit me like a tidal wave. I collapsed onto the dirt, gasping for breath, staring up at the starless sky. For a long time, I lay there, too stunned to move. The whispers were gone. The oppressive weight that had clung to me for hours, or maybe it had been days, was lifted. But as the adrenaline ebbed, doubt crept in. Had I sealed it away for good? Or had I simply delayed the inevitable? The townsfolk didn't ask questions when I returned. Marla looked at me with wide, knowing eyes as I sat at the diner counter, my clothes tattered and my face streaked with dirt. She slid a steaming mug of coffee toward me without a word. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, after a long silence. I nodded, my hands trembling around the cup. It's sealed, for now." Her face fell, but she didn't press further. I think she understood better than I did. Black Hollow was a place where secrets were buried, but never truly gone. Weeks passed. I stayed in Black Hollow, repairing the damage to my body and mind as best as I could. At first, I thought the nightmares would be the worst of it. Visions of the pit, the entity's towering form, the faces of those it had consumed. But something lingered, a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. Every so often, I'd feel it again, that pressure, the faintest trace of whispers. When I turned, nothing was there. I told myself it was just my imagination, the after effects of trauma, but deep down I knew the truth. The entity wasn't entirely gone. Part of it had escaped, clinging to me like a parasite, feeding off the wounds I carried. One night, as I sat alone in the small cabin I'd rented, I heard it again. My name, faint but unmistakable, spoken in my own voice. "Greg." The air grew heavy, the shadows deepened, and a familiar dread began to creep in. It was still with me. And I realized then what the entity had meant. My pain was its lifeline, a tether it had used to survive. As long as I carried my regrets, my self-loathing, it would remain, growing stronger. It wasn't trapped in the mine anymore. It was trapped in me. Sometimes we run from our pain, thinking we can bury it. But some wounds run too deep. Some burdens follow you, no matter how far you go. And in the darkest corners of the mind, they find a way to grow. I am Greg Larson, and beneath the surface of me, something waits. I moved into the house on Birchwood Lane at the start of October. It was the kind of house you'd see in an old postcard. Victorian style, white picket fence, a yard overgrown with wild flowers. To most people, it probably looked quaint. To me, it was a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the ashes of my failed life in the city. The first night was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as I moved boxes into the living room. The neighborhood was silent, almost too silent, but after months of chaos, I welcomed it. The second night, I heard the tapping. It was faint, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it might be the old pipes or the wind brushing against the siding. I told myself it was nothing as I went to bed, but I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound again. Steady, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. It came from inside the walls. The next day, I mentioned it to my neighbor, Claire. She was middle-aged with a warm smile and kind eyes, but as soon as I brought up the tapping, her expression stiffened. "Old houses make noises," she said quickly, avoiding my gaze. "You'll get used to it." Then she changed the subject, asking about my plans for the yard. The rest of the week passed in a haze of unpacking and cleaning. I painted the kitchen, fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, and tried to ignore the growing list of things that didn't feel right. It wasn't just the tapping. The mirrors in the house gave me pause. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but every time I caught my reflection, it seemed off. My face would look slightly elongated, my eyes a little too wide, or my expression subtly different. One evening as I brushed my teeth, I swear my reflection smiled at me, even though my lips didn't move. I stopped using the mirrors after that. The worst were the shadows. I'd see them from the corner of my eye, darting movements that disappeared the moment I turned my head. Once, as I stood in the hallway, I saw a figure standing at the far end, tall, thin, and utterly still. But when I blinked, it was gone. The isolation didn't help. Might hope moving to Birchwood Lane would bring me peace, but the neighbors were friendly only on the surface. Claire waved when she saw me, but her warmth seemed forced. The others barely acknowledged me at all. And when I asked about the house's history, their responses were curt. "You're the first one to stay here in a while," Claire had said once, her voice laced with something I couldn't place. "Hold," I pressed. She hesitated, then shrugged. "People move on. It's a quiet street." Maybe too quiet for some. By November, the tapping had escalated. It wasn't just at night anymore. It came in short bursts throughout the day. It followed me from room to room, as though the house was alive, listening, waiting. I hired a pest control company, thinking maybe it was mice or squirrels. The man they sent was a burly guy named Dave who had seen it all. He spent 2 hours inspecting the house before coming back to me, pale and visibly shaken. "There's nothing in there," he said, his voice trembling. "What do you mean? There has to be something." "No nests, no droppings, no signs of any animals, but—" He trailed off, glancing at the walls. "But what?" "The insulation's strange. Looks like someone tried to patch over something, but can't figure out why. You might want to call a contractor." That night, the tapping turned into scratching. It was louder, more frantic, like nails clawing against the plaster. I couldn't sleep, so I wandered the house with a flashlight, searching for the source. In the dim glow, I noticed something I hadn't before. A hairline crack running along the baseboard in the living room. Curious, I knelt down and traced it with my fingers. The wall felt hollow. I didn't have a crowbar, so I used the claw end of a hammer to pry at the crack. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing a hidden door, its edges warped and stained. A wave of cold air seeped through the gap, and with it came the unmistakable stench of decay. My hands shook as I pulled the door open. Inside was a narrow staircase leading downward, disappearing into darkness. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and echoing from the depths. It wasn't a whisper, it was a command. I didn't have tools, so I grabbed the nearest thing, a hammer I'd used to hang pictures. With trembling hands, I struck the wall. The first hit cracked the plaster, and a puff of dust filled the air. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse racing, but the scratching noises seemed to intensify, as if urging me forward. I swung again, harder this time. The wall gave way, revealing a dark, narrow cavity. The air that seeped out was foul, like something long decayed. I shone my flashlight into the space, squinting through the gloom. And that's when I saw them. Skeletal remains, tangled together in a grotesque embrace. Bones warped with age, fragments of clothing clinging to them like brittle cobwebs. A rush of nausea hit me. But before I could look away, something else caught my eye. A crude symbol scratched into the back wall of the cavity, pulsing faintly with a sickly glow. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the scratching didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was alive, screaming at me. I ran to the front door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked at the knob, threw my weight against it, but it was as if the house had sealed me in. The tapping turned into a deafening cacophony, echoing from every wall. "Let me out," I screamed. A voice whispered behind me, soft and guttural, "You can't leave." I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, emaciated, its limbs too long, its eyes voids of darkness. It stepped closer, and as it moved, I realized it wasn't walking, but gliding, its body melding seamlessly with the walls. What are you?" I choked out. "I am despair," it hissed. "I am the weight of every regret, every failure you buried deep inside. You brought me here. You fed me." "No!" My voice was barely a whisper. But deep down, I knew it was true. I'd moved here to escape the ruins of my life, my failed career, the betrayal of someone I loved. I'd let those feelings consume me, and now they had taken shape, feeding the thing that lived in the house. The figure's face twisted into a grotesque parody of my own, its voice echoing my darkest thoughts. "You're not good enough. You never were. You never will be." Tears streamed down my face as the words clawed at me, each one a dagger in my chest. But something inside me pushed back. Anger, defiance, maybe even hope. "No," I said, my voice trembling but growing stronger. "You don't control me. I do." The figure recoiled, hissing like a snake. The walls shuddered, cracks spiderwebbing across them. I thought of everything I'd been running from, every mistake and failure, and instead of hiding from them, I faced them. "I'm not perfect," I said, stepping toward the figure. "I've made mistakes, I've failed, but I'm still here. I'm still standing." The glow from the symbol on the wall dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. The creature screamed, a sound that rattled my bones, and then it began to dissolve, its form collapsing into shadows that melted into the cracks of the walls. The noise stopped. The house fell silent. I stood there shaking as the front door creaked open. Cold night air rushed in, and for the first time in months, I felt free. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I packed what little I'd unpacked and left Birchwood Lane for good. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood dark and lifeless, as if it had never been occupied at all. But as I turned the corner, I thought I saw something in the upstairs window, a shadowy figure watching me leave. The house remains a trap for the lost and broken, and the watcher waits, feeding on the despair of those who don't know how to fight back. But I know now that the real terror wasn't in the house. It was inside me all along. I never asked to learn astral projection. It just happened. At first, I thought it was just another vivid dream, a disembodied weightlessness, a sense of floating above my bed. But when I looked down and saw myself lying there, I knew it wasn't a dream. It became my escape. I had plenty to run from. My twin sister Beth had died 6 months ago. Suicide, they said. She left no note, no explanation, just silence. We hadn't spoken in 2 years before it happened. A rift caused by some stupid argument. I could barely even remember now. The guilt gnawed at me, so when I found this strange ability, I used it to retreat from the suffocating regret. At first, my projections were brief and clumsy, like a child learning to walk. I floated aimlessly through my apartment, marveling at the surrealness of it all. Then I grew bold. I ventured further, to our childhood home, now abandoned after our parents sold it. That was where I saw her for the first time. She stood in the living room, back turned to me, her long brown hair cascading over her shoulders just like I remembered. "Beth?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She turned slowly, her face lighting up with the kind of joy that broke my heart. "Elisa," she said, her voice soft but warm, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I ran to her, but we couldn't touch. My hand passed through hers like smoke. "It's really you," I sobbed. I'm so sorry, Beth. I should have been there." "Shh," she said, her hand hovering near my cheek. "It's okay. I'm here now. We have time." For weeks I returned to the house, eager to see her again. We'd talk for hours, reminiscing about old times. But something felt off. She didn't remember certain things, little details, like the name of our favorite childhood cat, or the way she used to hate peanut butter. I brushed it off at first. It had been years after all. Maybe death blurred memories. But then there were the other things. Her voice, though comforting, carried an undertone of something I couldn't place, like a faint echo just out of sync. Sometimes she'd stare at me too long, her expression unreadable, as if she were studying me. One night, as I prepared to leave, she grabbed my wrist. I flinched at the sudden contact. She'd never touched me before. Her grip felt solid, too real. "Stay longer," she pleaded, her eyes wide and glistening. "Please, I get so lonely when you're gone." The desperation in her voice froze me. "I can't. I don't think I'm supposed to be here this long." She let go, but her gaze lingered as I willed myself back to my body. That's when the bruises started. I woke the next morning with an aching wrist, the skin mottled with purples and greens where Beth had grabbed me. My breath hitched. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd slept wrong, or maybe I'd bumped into something and forgotten. But the bruises grew worse each time I projected. They weren't just on my wrists anymore. They showed up on my arms, my legs, even my neck. Worse, strange things began happening in the waking world. My reflection in the bathroom mirror would lag, moving a fraction of a second after I did. Sometimes it didn't move at all, staring back at me with wide, accusing eyes. And then there was her voice. I heard it everywhere, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the creak of the floorboards. "Stay longer, Elisa," it whispered. "You don't belong there." One night I stood before the mirror, studying my reflection. My hair was a mess, my eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But as I stared, something shifted. My reflection tilted its head, not the way I had. The movement was sharp, deliberate, wrong. "Eth?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The reflection's lips curled into a smile, but mine stayed still. I stumbled back from the mirror, heart hammering in my chest. The grin on my reflection didn't fade. It deepened, twisting into something unnatural. Then it moved. The reflection stepped closer to the glass, leaning in as if to press its face against the surface. I froze, my breath shallow and ragged. My lips finally moved, but my voice didn't come out. The reflections did. "She misses you, Elisa," it said, the voice warping into Beth's tone. "Don't you miss her?" I turned and ran, slamming the bathroom door behind me. The sound of my feet pounding against the floor filled the apartment as I dove into bed, pulling the covers up like a child. But sleep didn't come. It never did anymore. Over the next few days, the bruises darkened, spreading like ink under my skin. I stopped projecting. I told myself it was over. I wouldn't go back to the childhood home, wouldn't see Beth again. But Beth didn't care about my resolve. She came to me anyway. It started with the mirrors, no matter where I was, in the bathroom, the kitchen, or even the rearview mirror of my car. She was there. At first, it was subtle, a flash of movement, her face peeking out behind mine for just a moment. Then it became undeniable. One morning, I caught her standing fully behind me in the hallway mirror. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her expression was blank, her eyes dull and sunken. "Well, are you ignoring me?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I'm not," I whispered. "You are," her tone sharpened like the edge of a knife. "Don't you care about me anymore? About what happened to me?" "I do care," I said, tears burning my eyes. I can't keep doing this, Beth. It's not healthy." Her reflection didn't reply, but her eyes followed me as I stepped away from the mirror. That night, I dreamed I was back in our childhood home. The air felt heavy, thick with a suffocating stillness. Beth sat in the living room, her back to me as she always was when I first arrived. "I'm here," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. She turned slowly, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I knew you'd come back." "I didn't want to," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But you did," she said, standing and taking a step toward me. Her movements were jerky, as though her joints didn't work quite right. "Ah, you always come back, Elisa." I stepped back, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. "I don't think you're Beth," I said, my throat dry. "I think you're something else." Her face twisted, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "Don't be silly. Of course I'm Beth." "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "Beth wouldn't want this. She wouldn't hurt me." Her smile vanished, You hurt me first." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, but something was wrong. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my body heavy as stone. My eyes darted around the room, catching the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the blinds. Then I saw her. Beth stood at the foot of my bed, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes gleamed in the dark like wet glass. "You left me?" she said, her voice low and guttural. "No," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if the sound even left my lips. "You left me," she screamed, her voice splitting the silence like thunder. I willed myself to move, to scream, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. She climbed onto the bed, her movements spider-like and grotesque. Her face hovered inches from mine, her breath cold against my skin. "Don't you get it?" she hissed. "Every time you leave, I get stronger. Every time you come back, I take more of you." Her hand pressed against my chest, and a cold, sinking sensation spread through me. It felt like she was pulling me apart, unraveling me thread by thread. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered. The darkness swallowed me. When I woke, it was morning. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, but it didn't feel warm. I looked down at my hands and saw bruises circling my wrists, deeper, darker than ever before. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection stared back at me. But something was wrong. It wasn't copying me. I raised my hand, it stayed still. I leaned forward, it smiled. "Eth?" I whispered. The reflection tilted its head, and Beth's voice echoed in my mind. "You're almost ready, Elisa. One more trip, and you'll never leave again." I don't know how long I lay there, pinned under the weight of Beth's presence. Time felt stretched, warped, like I was caught in a loop of suffocating terror. But finally, I moved. Or at least I thought I did. My arm jerked upward, breaking free of the invisible hold. I gasped for air and scrambled out of bed, my limbs shaking as I backed away from her figure on the bed. Except it wasn't her. It was me. I froze, staring at my own sleeping body tangled in the sheets. My chest rose and fell, my face slack with unconsciousness. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. I wasn't awake. I had projected again. Whether by choice or force, I couldn't say. Beth stood at the edge of the room, her head cocked to the side, watching me with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "See what happens when you leave your body too often?" she said, her voice mocking. "You're making it so easy for me, Elisa." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. I didn't leave." "Oh, it's very real." She stepped closer, her form flickering like a faulty projection. "You've been running from the truth for so long, haven't you? You weren't there for me, and now you're not even there for yourself." I turned toward my body, willing myself to return, to wake up, but nothing happened. My fingers passed through my own arm like smoke. And Beth laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "You don't get to just walk back in. You've left it empty for too long, and I'm tired of being the one stuck on the other side." "No!" I shouted, spinning to face her. "You're not Beth. You're something else, something pretending to be her." Her smile faded, replaced by a cold, seething rage. "I am Beth," she said, her voice trembling with venom. "I'm the part of her you ignored, the pain you left behind, and now I'm taking what's mine." She lunged toward me, and the room spun violently. The walls of my apartment blurred and melted away, replaced by the familiar but decayed interior of our childhood home. The air smelled of mildew and rot, and the once cozy living room was shrouded in darkness. I tried to run, but my feet felt like they were sinking into the floor. Beth was everywhere. Her laughter echoed from every corner, her face flashing in and out of the shadows. "You can't escape me," she hissed, her voice all around me. "You never could." I reached the staircase, the only thing that still felt solid, and scrambled upward, desperate to find a way out. At the top was the mirror from our old bedroom, the one we used to share as kids. Its surface shimmered, alive and pulsing. I knew instinctively that this was my way back. I reached for it, but before my fingers could touch the glass, Beth appeared in the reflection, her eyes blazing with fury. She grabbed my arm, her grip like iron, and yanked me backward. "You're not leaving," she screamed. I fought against her, kicking and clawing. "You don't belong here," I shouted back, my voice cracking with desperation. "You're not Beth." Her grip faltered for just a moment, and I seized the chance. I threw myself toward the mirror, my hand breaking through the surface like water. I gasped as my eyes flew open. I was back in my body, drenched in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. My room was quiet, eerily still. The shadows seemed longer, darker, but the air was familiar. Mine. I stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the sink for support. My reflection stared back at me, pale and haggard, but normal. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. It was over. I was safe. Then my reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. "Finally," Beth said through my lips. "You should have stayed longer." The bathroom door slammed shut, trapping me inside the mirror. And I screamed as my twin, now wearing my face, walked back into the world. I've always been drawn to mysteries, the kind that keep you up at night, turning over pieces of a puzzle in your mind. As a journalist, I thrive on uncovering the unknown, seeking truth behind what others might dismiss as superstition or mere coincidence. But even I wasn't prepared for the truth I stumbled upon when I began investigating the missing persons cases. It all started with a simple lead. Someone had gone missing after a supposed astral projection session. That was 6 months ago. Since then, more cases had popped up, each one more disturbing than the last. People had vanished, leaving behind perfectly preserved bodies. No sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just an eerie stillness. I started talking to families, friends, anyone connected to the missing. That's when I found the support group. The group met once a week in a shabby room at the edge of town. The air was thick with unease, like the walls themselves were trying to hold something back. The members of the group were an eclectic mix. Some were grieving, others were angry, and a few, like myself, were just trying to make sense of what had happened to their loved ones. They all shared one thing in common. They believed the disappearances were linked to astral projection. At first I thought they were all just grasping at straws, desperate to find a reason for the inexplicable. But then they told me things that stopped me cold. Stories of people who had projected out of their bodies, exploring the unknown realms of consciousness, only to never return. Some spoke of encountering something in the void, something that didn't belong, a darkness that pulled at them, tried to trap them. And then there was the door. One of the women, Evelyn, was particularly adamant. "There's a place," she said, her voice trembling, "a labyrinth. It's filled with doors. Behind each one is a person who never made it back. Their souls are trapped. But the worst part? There's a door with my name on it. And I know that if I open it, I'll be trapped too." I didn't believe her, not at first, but the more I listened, the more I wondered. I was already deep into my investigation, and the missing persons cases seemed to be pointing to something bigger, something beyond just people disappearing. I had to see for myself. That night I'd tried astral projection. I'd read about it in old journals and on obscure online forums. I followed the methods they'd described. A deep breathing, focusing on my mind's eye, and letting go of my physical body. At first, I felt nothing. But then something shifted. It was subtle, like a tug at my core. My body felt light, weightless. I was in a void, a vast, infinite blackness that stretched in every direction without end. But then I saw it. Dozens, no, hundreds of doors. They floated in the dark, each one different, yet all hauntingly familiar. On each door, there was a nameplate. I froze. Each name was one of the missing persons. I walked closer to the nearest door. The name on the plate was Sarah. I could feel something behind it. Someone trapped, calling for help. I could almost hear their voice, muffled, desperate. It wasn't just a scream. It was the kind of scream that tore at your soul. I couldn't help myself. I reached for the handle, but something stopped me. A feeling in my gut told me not to. I withdrew my hand and moved to the next door. And the next. And the next. Some doors had no sound behind them, empty, lifeless, but others screamed in agony, calling for release, for freedom. I couldn't help but feel drawn to them. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A door that stood out from the rest. It was larger than the others, darker, almost as though it absorbed the surrounding darkness. The nameplate was cracked, but I could still make out the letters. It was my name. Said. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't remember coming across it. I didn't remember my name being written on any of the other doors. My pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. There was something about that door that felt wrong, a dread that clawed at me, deep inside. A voice whispered, just out of reach, warning me, "Don't open it." I didn't know what would happen if I did, but something in me was terrified. I couldn't let it open. I turned around, trying to ignore the growing sense of urgency creeping up my spine. I had to leave. I needed to get back to my body. I'd learned enough, seen enough. I wasn't ready for this. But just before I could leave the void, I heard it, a low, creaking sound, like a door opening. It wasn't mine, but it didn't matter. Every door around me began to creak open. One by one, they all opened, and the voices of the trapped souls screamed louder, more frantic. I rushed back. I had to leave, had to wake up. But as I reached for the exit, something dark reached for me, pulling me back, wrapping around me like a chain. The door to my own soul opened wider. I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. But something was wrong. My room looked different, darker. The air felt heavy. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped. I opened my eyes to a sterile white ceiling. The harsh lights buzzed above me, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. I was in a hospital bed, my limbs restrained. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But I could hear something, a faint creaking sound. I turned my head, eyes widening in horror, as I saw the door to my hospital room slowly, inexorably open. And behind it, the darkness of the void. The door to my soul, to my doom. And I couldn't escape. I stood frozen in front of the door with my name on it, the air thick with an unexplainable dread. The darkness around me seemed to pulse, as if the void itself was alive, watching. My body trembled, not from the cold, but from a deep, primal fear that I couldn't shake. I wanted to turn away, to leave the labyrinth and return to my physical body, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Something was pulling me toward it, like an invisible force. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold surface of the door. The moment my skin made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through me, sharp and agonizing. I recoiled, but the sensation lingered, buzzing under my skin, making it feel as though my very essence was being tested. And then I heard it, a whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt like it came from inside me. An echo of my own thoughts, distorted and hollow. "Don't open it, Jane." I blinked, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice didn't belong to me. It was a warning, desperate, pleading. My mind raced with confusion. Why was it telling me this? Why was I here, in this twisted place, staring at a door that shouldn't exist? I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the nameplate. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to know what lay behind it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this door, my door, held the key to everything. And yet I couldn't bring myself to open it. There was something worse than the unknown, something terrifying about the idea of knowing what lay behind that door. A voice deep in my gut told me that if I opened it, I would never return. I would become just like the others, the missing, the lost, trapped in the void, tethered forever. I turned away, the sound of my heartbeat deafening in the stillness. As I walked, the labyrinth seemed to stretch endlessly before me, each step further from the door that bore my name. I moved with purpose now, determined to leave the void behind and return to my body. But no matter how far I walked, the space around me never changed. The walls of darkness closed in, and the doors, with their twisted, anguished souls, surrounded me like a cage. And then I felt it, a pull. It was subtle at first, like a tug at the base of my spine, but it grew stronger, relentless. My heart pounded as the pull became a force, dragging me back toward my door. I tried to resist, to fight against it, but it was no use. My legs moved on their own, carrying me closer, closer to the one door that I knew I should never open. I reached it again, my hand trembling as it hovered over the cold handle. A scream, my own perhaps, echoed in my mind. "Don't do it!" But the voice was distant now, drowned out by the insistent compulsion to open the door. In a moment of panic, I yanked my hand back, but I could still feel the pull. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something I couldn't escape. I had to leave. I had to return. With everything I had, I focused on my body, my breath, on the world I knew I'd left behind. The pull lessened, and I felt the familiar tug of gravity, the sensation of being anchored. But just as I was about to break free, The door creaked. The sound was like a whisper in the wind, a soft sigh, but in that moment it felt as though the entire labyrinth had exhaled in unison. The door was opening. I tried to move, to push myself away, but I couldn't. The door was pulling me in, its presence overpowering. I could hear someone on the other side whispering my name. "Jade, come in." The voice was unmistakably mine, and yet it wasn't. It was distorted, hollow, like a version of myself that had already been lost. With a final, desperate effort, I snapped my eyes open, willing myself back to my body. I felt the pull of my physical form like a lifeline, dragging me from the void. The coldness of the air, the weight of my limbs, the taste of stale hospital oxygen filling my lungs. It all rushed back at once. I gasped for breath, my eyes darting around the room. I was in a hospital bed. The sterile white walls, the beeping of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic, it was all too familiar. But something wasn't right. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic surged in my chest as I struggled against my immobile limbs. Why couldn't I move? My heart raced, pounding against my ribs, but no matter how hard I willed my body to obey, it refused. And then I heard it. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, the sound of something heavy shifting, something old, something uninvited. The door to my hospital room, the one that had been closed, was slowly, inexorably creaking open. My breath hitched, my throat tightened, the door was moving on its own, no one was there. I was alone, but something was coming. I tried to scream, but my mouth was dry, my eyes shot to the door, my heart hammering in my chest as the creak grew louder. The door, it was opening wider, and behind it, darkness loomed, swallowing the light from the hallway. The pull from the void, the door with my name. I had thought I'd escaped it, but now I knew I hadn't. And in the dark beyond the door, I saw it, a shadow moving toward me. It was waiting for me. The door to the void wasn't just a door, it was a trap. And I had walked right into it. I woke up with a gasp, my eyes snapping open, my chest heaving as I struggled to fill my lungs with air. For a moment, I couldn't tell where I was. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as though I had just returned from a long, deep sleep. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body refused to cooperate. Panic surged through me. My thoughts scrambled, but they were sluggish, as if trying to swim through thick fog. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I tried to blink away the blurriness, to shake the dizziness that threatened to consume me, but my vision remained blurred. I felt the sterile coldness of metal beneath me, the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. It was then that I realized I wasn't in my apartment. I was in a hospital room. A sharp, disorienting sense of vertigo hit me as I tried to speak, but no sound came from my throat. My hands shot up to my face, but I couldn't feel them, couldn't feel anything from the neck down. My panic grew and I tried to scream, but my voice was locked inside me. I was paralyzed. And then it hit me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, unresponsive. The door, the one with my name on it, the one I had almost opened, it wasn't just a door. It was a warning, a curse, and now, somehow I had become part of it. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps, muffled voices outside the room. Someone was coming, but I didn't know if it was too late. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body wouldn't respond. I was locked in this strange, unfeeling prison, but my mind was clear. My mind was racing. I thought back to the void, to the labyrinth, the doors, the souls trapped behind them. Evelyn had warned me about the door with my name. She had said it would tether me forever. But I had thought I could escape it. I was wrong. The room was deathly still. The air seemed heavier now, pressing in on me from all sides. And then I heard it. The creak of a door. The door. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it made my blood run cold. I tried to turn my head to see where the noise was coming from, but my body refused to obey. From the corner of my eye, I saw it, the door to my hospital room. It was open just a crack. I hadn't been like that before. I knew it. It wasn't supposed to be open. The door creaked again, this time louder. The crack widened, and in the darkness beyond, I thought I saw something. Or someone. But no, there was nothing there. Just a deep, endless blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear my own heartbeat, each beat like a drum in the silence. My thoughts spiraled. Too fast, too scattered. My breath quickened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. Then the whisper, that same voice, that same hollow, distorted sound. Jade. It was my name, but twisted. It was me, but it wasn't. The voice called to me. From beyond the door, from that impossible darkness. It beckoned me, luring me toward it, pulling at the thread of my soul. I didn't want to go. I couldn't. But I couldn't move either. The door creaked again, and this time, the darkness seeped into the room. Slowly, it crawled across the floor, cold and suffocating, like smoke, like something alive. It curled around the edge of the bed, reaching toward me, inch by inch, until it was just inches from my face. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs of frost. The blackness enveloped me, swallowing the edges of my vision, wrapping around me like a shroud. And then, with a final agonizing click, the door to my room swung wide open. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But I felt it. I felt it all. The pull was back. That same force, that insistent, twisting pressure from the void, was dragging me toward the door, toward the darkness beyond. The labyrinth was waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that cut through the fear, that I had become just like the others, just like the souls trapped behind those doors. My body was still here, but I was already gone. My name, my soul, had been claimed by the void. The door was open, and there was no turning back. The locked door was never meant to be closed.